Senhoras e senhores, bom dia. Damos início ao quarto dia do sexto Seminário
Good
Internacional.
morning. We're going to start with the sixth seminary, Safe Work,
Acidentes e doenças
Prevention of
ocupacionais.
Accidents and Occupational Diseases. We inform that this seminar is being broadcast and streamlined on the YouTube channel of TST, and the link for the English language is at the description of the video. We remind you that the certification, for the certification, you have to be mentioned, it will be the registry of your presence here every single day. In order to get the certification, you have to be present 75% of the time. The parts of the people in the panel and new models of work and the post-pandemic and impact on the health. The President, Minister Augusto César Leite de Carvalho from the Superior Court of Work, and the coordinator of panel, Mr. José Machado, Judge André Machado Cavalcante from the 10th region, and the national manager of the program Safe Work. And as panelists, the Senator of the Republic, Fabiano Calderato from the Federal Senate. And of the School of the University in Portugal. And Mrs. Ana Cláudia Moreira Cardoso, professor invited in the Social Sciences Department of the Federal University of Juiz de Fora. Now the Justice Augusto César Leite de Carvalho has the floor. Good morning, everyone. I would like to greet the organization of the sixth seminary of the International Seminary Safe Work from the Justice of Work, the Justice or Labor Justice, and also because of the choice of speakers and that are internationally renowned and have a lot of sensibility. And as we're gonna be able to see in this panel during the work in the morning. So I'd like to greet not only my friend and colleague, André Machado Cavalcante, who is going to coordinate the works here, but also the speakers of the conference and seminar, Senator Fabiano Contarato, and whose work has been an exemplar and a reference in politics for all of us. And everyone is anxious and eager to hear him today. Also, Professor Pedro Nogueira, actually Mrs. Nogueira, and she is going to talk. And she's a professor at the University of Domingo at the port, and she has had everybody's paying attention to her work very carefully, and people who are interested in the topic. And she's talking and studying about algorithmic discrimination, which is a novelty in the cyber area, and it doesn't necessarily means any evolution or any progress for our civilization. We have to work so that the situation will be reverted, and Professor Ana Cláudia Moreira Cardoso, and whose texts work in the same aspect, and they brought attention or shed light at the precarious work that is being carried out because it doesn't have any formal connection to an employer, and it cannot be protected through our social network structure and regarding work security. Now I'll pass the floor to our coordinator, Dr. André Machado. He's the judge of the 10th region. He's the national manager of the program Safe Work and for reading the curriculum of the first panelist. Good morning, everyone. First, I would like to greet our Justice Coordinator, Delarantes, and Maria Helena, who is also helping us at holding this event, and our national managers as well. And to say that it's a great pleasure, considering the admiration that I have for you. And I'm going to start reading the curriculum of our first panelist, Senator Fabiano Contarato, and emphasizing the words of the Justice Luis Cesar to be here, to the honor to have you here, considering the term that you have, which is exemplary. He is a senator. Senator Fabiano Contarato is a teacher, a speaker, and a humanitarian activist. He's graduated in law from the University of Vila Velha and specialist in impacts of the violence in school by the Oswaldo Cruz Foundation. Besides having a post-graduation in law, in criminal law and procedural criminal law by the University of Espírito Santo, and he is a police chief. He was a police chief of the state of Espírito Santo. He also worked at the General Controller at the State Controller's Office and Transparency of the Espírito Santo. Now I pass the floor to the Justice Augusto Cesar. I thank Dr. André Machado Cavalcante, and I also would like to thank Minister Delarantes and Maura too for organizing this event, to helping. And I ask for the panel, the trends of legislation in terms of discrimination at work and health, Senator Fabiano Contarato. You have the floor, Senator. Good morning, everyone. First, I would like to initially thank the Superior Court of Labor. And here I would like to thank especially Justice Augusto Cesar Carvalho and Dr. Machado Cavalcante too. It's a person that I admire a lot. And I also would like to compliment or greet Professor Augusto Moreira from the University of Portugal. It's a satisfaction to be here with you at the seminar. Dr. Ana Cláudia Moreira Cardoso too. She is a professor, invited professor, also in the social sciences of the University of Juiz de Fora. Even though I don't work in labor law or in the labor courts, I'm not a law specialist, but I feel like being or belonging to labor justice because all my life I've been seeing the possibility for us to reduce inequalities, and it's a commitment of all of us because all of us are responsible and all of us are part of the same human society. And this commitment says, and not only for the politician and for the people who work with law, but for everyone in civil society too, this is important. So within law school, we have specific subjects for labor law and labor procedural law. But I'm always moved by labor justice because it has a more humane look or consideration, and it's not based on the Napoleonic positivism. It's not restricted to an interpretation or a literal analysis of the law. It has an contextual interpretation, historical, with comparative law and with sociological aspects as well. And that makes labor justice or brings it closer to the population as a whole. And here in Brazil, of course, that I have my bias here because I love and I have a special place in my heart for the labor law, and I will always defend this segment. And which is the people who don't have the, or minorities in our societies that have the need to be helped. And of course, there has to be justice and balance by between the generation of jobs and the economy, but it has this humane look. And in order to talk about this topic that reflects directly and in many aspects of people's lives, I have to go back in history sometime. I'm very sad as a citizen, and I don't speak only as a citizen or a senator, but as a citizen, because people are criminalizing human rights, and that's some people. And this is very serious. We have to understand what is human rights. So human rights, it's a group of natural rights. And what are the natural rights? These are the ones that we have, that every person has, regardless of their race, ethnicity, religion, origin, or sexual orientation. And they're called natural rights. So when these natural rights are registered in a legislation, they start being called fundamental rights. And we do have this in our constitutional and law and in the international treaties, which Brazil is a signatory. So we have to understand that in 1979, the Czech law specialist, inspired by the French revolutionary values, equality, free liberty, and brotherhood, he talked about the first generation human rights, second and third generation rights, and there are even fourth generation rights already. And here we have to understand that human rights of first generation are focused on liberty, on civil rights, the political rights, the ones that are second rights, the equality and the economic rights and social rights as well. And here we see labor rights. And here it's where located the labor rights. And the third generation of human rights would include the diffuse rights such as fraternity and solidarity. Why am I saying this? Because our Constitution from October 5th, 1988, that just turned 30, and it's called the Citizen Constitution or the Higher Pact, and it's a sixth article. It has a specific provision that mentions social rights, and it ranks a number of rights. Among them is the right to health, leisure, and work, and place to live. So I believe that the National Congress, and I would like to admit my own fault here to have a mea culpa, be it the House of Representatives or the Senate, it has to provide force, to put force into this rights or provide effectivity. And when we're talking about a neoliberal state, and whenever I say there's a minimum state or a smaller state, to the smaller state is going to affect who? Because as a congressman, I need a state that will provide effectivity to these guarantees. I'll mention one example. The seventh article in the fourth line in the federal constitution, it's very clear when it says that the federal government should establish a minimum wage that will be able to provide the family with the education, housing, and working. And we have a very small salary of 1,100 reais. So what's the point of saying this and having this provision within the Constitution? And as a part of the democratic which is the constitutional law, and its position at the seventh article and the fourth line, saying that the minimum wage will have to provide for all of these aspects of life and to provide the minimum living conditions, living requirements for everyone. And we have a minimum wage of 1,100 reais. And Giese says that it should be 500 and 5,500 reais. So inequality and the violence to rights of workers, it starts with the permission granted by the Congress when it doesn't implement these conditions to provide effectivity to this. And that would be very easy to be fulfilled if we followed what is provided in the federal constitution. It says that the federal government has to establish a tax on big fortunes. When you talk about big fortunes, you're just gonna get 0.0098%. And with that, we're going to have tax income of billions of reais, both for the federal government and the states, as well as the municipal governments. And it's this revenue or this income that will provide effectivity to this right, this constitutional provision that is provided both in the 7th or in the 6th article, that everyone has rights to education, housing, leisure, clothing, and many other rights, many rights. So one thing that we have to be careful with, and I'm also part of this system, and this is a mea culpa that we're doing too. We have to know where this disease is situated that is mitigating human rights and workers' rights as well, which are all part of the Constitution. So if we don't provide effectivity to these essential human rights and our constitutional rights that are also ranked in international treaties, if we don't implement a tax on big fortunes,
dentro do IBGE, que faz uma análise.
At the PNAD, it's a part of the IBGE system and the institute. We have to listen to this. So now in Brazil have 80 million Brazilians who are in the poverty situation or under the poverty line. We have 25 million Brazilians who are unemployed and who have a poor employment. And when I talk about this, it's important for Parliament to, in the topics talking about discrimination of work, it's important for us to admit our own fault. If you have the social inequality and violation of this constitutional rights, and they are a provision, because when it says in 6th article that public health is a right of everyone, but it's also an obligation provided by the state. But people are dying in public hospitals, and I say this because I come from a poor family. I always used the National United System, healthcare system. So I always went to public school. So everyone is entitled to healthcare, and that was made worse by the pandemic. We have a sanitary crisis with over 600,000 people who lost their lives in this pandemic. And I would like to honor them and remember them, because more than 20 million people were infected by this virus, and a lot of people want to retire due to the consequences of COVID. So the situation is getting worse and worsening by every day. And when we talk about the 6th article that everybody has the right to education, we know that in Brazil, and the minister, Dr. André, knows very well, and Professor knows this as well, Professor Ana Cláudia, that when we make an analysis of federal university and superior university, superior institutes of education, they are a role model for education. We have a very good system whether in the federal institutes and the public federal and state universities. The problem with Brazil is connected to basic education, of fundamental education, because 83% of these schools don't have a lab science. They don't have a library, 70%, 73% don't have accessibility.
73% não tem quadra poliesportiva.
73% doesn't have a sports court. So how does a poor person's son or daughter, who wants to study a psychology or medical goes to medical school, he will be able to do that if he doesn't have the basic. And this young person doesn't have access to public health care that has a good quality. Their parents have barely any worker rights, because in 2017 we had an attack to the labor rights. That's the mark, and I've been seeing this whenever whenever you want to attack workers' rights. It's basically trying to generate income and employment. That's what happened with the labor reform. And then you have the temporary work, and there was also a provision that the company can be homologated or confirm the finalizing of the workers' workers' contract, and pregnant women could work and would be able to would be exposed to workers to situations where their health would be affected. So there is a worsening of the situation. The economy was not leveraged and it didn't grow. In 2019, there was the Prevention reform. So we're gonna generate income and works. Once again, the workers' rights was attacked. How can we not mention this? During the Social Security reform, actually, in many different public hearings, there was no participation of senators. We have 81 senators, and then we just had 2, 3, 4 senators in public hearings to debate the Social Security or reform pension and pension reforms. And we ended the pension by death. And 80% of the people who get this pension are women who stop working to raise a family, and they give up their professional life, because we're still in a sexist country, and she stops working to take care of the husband. And before that, when the husband died, she would get the pension. And nowadays it's going to be a lot harder. And I had some federal university studies that talked about the pension reform, and it's very hard for a Brazilian worker to have their labor contract, the Brazilian labor contract, signed. So if you think about a person that is 50, 55-year old that is fired, if he wants to get back to job market, it's very hard. So once again, there is the argument that we're gonna leverage the economy and generate more jobs, and that didn't happen. Justice Augusto. Now we have the administrative reform. Once again, they want to end the stability of a civil servant. I cannot understand the path that Brazil is treading. It has to own up, and it has to respect what is present at the Constitution. That is a social pact. That's not something that I'm mentioning. So everybody people have a right for this, and they have housing rights, they have health rights, we have to strengthen labor unions, because we know that there is an unequal situation between the employer and the employee. It's a completely disproportional situation. We've been seeing situations where there was prejudice and or situations that expose people to embarrassing situations, metal detectors, and just because people had black skin. So if you say that everybody is right, considering the law, that is basically very removed from reality. We have to repeat this constantly, as Plato used to say, because we have over 52% of the Brazilian population who are made up of women. The three powers, or the three branches actually, that was never presided by a woman was the legislative branch. And I was at the National Assembly, I was a state assembly of the Mato Grosso do Sul state, and there were no women there represented. And that shows something. I cannot lose my capacity to be arise or angry about something. We cannot consider the situation. If 52% of the population is made up of women, how can there be no representatives within the state assembly? 85% of the population in Salvador City is made up of Black people and of mixed race people. And there was never a mayor elected in the city that of this color. And that shows a problem. So we have to think about it systematically. And the trend is that the legislative branch connected to these topics such as security, health, and work discrimination, this is not a reality, and this is basically not a reality. We know that there is sexism, and the COVID Judicial Committee, Congressional Committee showed that so many representatives that talked about this, and men especially, they were angry, and but they never were labeled out of control, but they labeled this woman a woman like this. And Brazil is sexist. When there is a person that is trying to debase a public person and authority, and this is a homophobic behavior as well. It's not only affecting me, it is also affecting the population as well. All of the population has to be affected because that affects the dignity of the human population. That's why I have such an admiration of labor justice, because labor justice is not restricted to the positive rights, and it doesn't think only about numbers, because behind each labor complaint there is a story, there is a family, there is a peculiar aspect, there are kids as well, sons and daughters. Salary is not just a pay for a service provided. It does have a social function too. President state is very wealthy. And it has potential. But I do have to say that, unfortunately, saying that everyone is similar in front of considering the law, without taking into consideration many aspects, this is far from reality. We still have a sexist country, and it's not enough for people to say, for the Constitution to say that men and women are equal, considering the law. We have a law that says that both men and women need to have the same salary. And the 21st century, we're trying to pass a law to try to state the obvious, which is that a man and a woman that perform the same job, they have to have the same salary. So men and women are equal in rights and obligations. You probably know what I'm going to talk about. When I talk about maternity leave was a big advance for women in Brazil. But what started happening? People stopped working and stopped hiring women, or they wanted to attest by saying that they're not pregnant or they're sterile. And there is a premise in the criminal law that says that you cannot be published without a sentence that established in the penal code. So right after a long time, there was a law or an article saying that there was a crime. So it was already hard for women to be part of the job market, to be it in the public or in the private sphere. But that increased, and discrimination against women in the labor areas also happens in the public service because they start in the same position and after the public test, but it's harder for them to get to managing positions in the same proportion as men. And to say that everybody is equal considering the law and without any distinction, after over 300 years of slavery in Brazil, we still are suffering the consequences of this in Brazil. That's why we have institutionalized racism. That's why we have institutionalized homophobia, because homosexuality until not very long ago, it was considered a disease. It was not like last century, it's recent past. We had condemnation just because they had a different sexual option. That is really serious.
Me perdoe, eu não quero ser técnico para falar.
I'm sorry, I don't want to be too technical here. I prefer this approach that thinks about this homophobia and racism and sexism that are institutionalized. Up to the change in the new civil code, if a woman was pregnant of a married man, this woman could not ask for a DNA test against a married man. She was considered not completely civil capable. So how can you say this? How can you say that women and rights are equal in rights and obligations, and not say that Brazil is racist? If we have this institutionalized racism, how can you not say that it's a homophobic country? If we have seen this, I said, I came out and I said that I was homosexual when I was 26 to 27 years old. I didn't want to say this before because I considered it wrong, because society always imposed this to the LGBTQ plus population. That is, and it's very hard because it's hard to go through this situation. And I remember
meus pais, 6 filhos, eu sou o mais novo, fui criado numa família católica.
I was raised in a Catholic family, and my father was a bus driver, and she was raising 6 kids, and I went to church, and I cried, and I prayed, and I asked God to change this within me, because society considered this or imposed this on me and said that it was a sin. And I had my first same-sex relation when I was 26 years old.
I was promoted because they had a personal assessment and I didn't have this social behavior, so I didn't get the promotion. You see, the worst type of racism hurts almost more than this hidden racism. And when we violated this, we focus on this study. Why? Because it's a way of us to compensate. It's not because of vanity, but I always thought for me to be accepted, I have to be the best in the world. Because I always heard, Justice, that for many people, without coming out, because I only had my first relationship when I was 26, 27, and before I heard that people said about me that, oh, I'm smart, but he is gay. So only the people that go through this really know. Nowadays, I'm married and I have 2 children. Nobody told me what I'm about to tell you, but when I adopted my first son, Gabriel, the Attorney General dared to say that he was against this double paternity, even though I have a certificate from the government because he said in Brazil, a child is only allowed to have one father and one mother. Or, and he used these words, even worse, the son of two fathers. I heard this when I became a senator. And so I represented against him, and this senator got 5 days of suspension. This is a very relevant story because it's not from the last century. I want my children to grow up and to be sure that I am fighting and that we can accomplish what is written in the Constitution, which is one of the fundamentals of the Constitution, which is to promote the well-being of everyone and abolish any type of discrimination. This day still hasn't arrived, but I will be here in the Senate or wherever fighting so that one day I have the pleasure and the pride to meet here with you and to be able to tell you, I'm very proud to be able to tell you that we have a Brazilian Federation, a democracy, which is the best place to plant and sow these rights. The difficult part is to defend democracy when you're in a state of dictatorship. So I want to have the pride to be able to tell you we are living in a Brazil where we are all equal in front of the law, regardless of your color or sexual orientation. And I want to thank everyone. Send a very hearty hug to everyone who is watching, because I think it's our mission to transform. And you've known me for a short period of time now. And people here, they usually are very stuck with their positions and titles and everything. And life is much more ethereal. And we are seeing that with the pandemic now. I always tell myself, I never look for being perfect, but I try to do it as best as I can. And how can we make it so that Brazil is inclusive and equal? This is a question that I will make to you, and I will ask you to ask yourself this every day. What am I doing to make Brazil a better place? And now I have to say, just to conclude, a part of a movie that I watched, which reflects, and I can tell you as a homosexual, as a declared homosexual, now today I can say this, but how many people paid with their lives so that I would be able to be here? Because I'm in a privileged position. I'm a cis white male. But what's the treatment that we give to transvestites and trans women and men? So we need to have this gratitude to be able to look to the past. And I would just like to end by saying that I watched a movie a long time ago, and in the end people ask, who are we? We are your judges, your police officers, your doctors, your dentists, your journalists. We live with you, we take care of you, we love you. We only ask that you let us live with dignity. Thank you very much. I humbly hope to have contributed with this speech, which wasn't technical. It was reflexive about what I understand it means to be a citizen, because it means to transform society. Thank you very much. Thank you, Senator. We know that the need of you to step back to be able to do your job is not an easy task. So I would like to thank you We know that you are busy and have to go now, but I would like to thank you for your important speech, and this empathy for labor law made me remember the reasons why I had this motivation so that I would stop being an attorney general, which is a job that I always enjoyed, and I still do, and to throw myself into this new world of social rights, which you had also referred to, and a little bit before the UN, which has a very similar speech, and they said that the rights and the freedoms, for example, the locomotion freedom, which we talked about, and the freedom of expression and knowledge and consciousness, all of these freedoms, they need this freedom in this cultural and economical rights, which are relegated to the back seat. One of them being that we eliminate all the inequality in regions, and that the role of the judiciary in search of this objective, which is a Republican objective and goal that is in our Constitution. And we are happy to say that today we are being presided by a woman, Justice Cristina, President of the court, and which in the judiciary system are in a minority. And this speech of the emancipation of gender is very important because it invokes this intersection of the reasons of discrimination. And we realize that its speech brings between the lines these various perspectives about these vulnerable parts in our society. And a speech that is purely economical and is not in harmony with the social dramas that are lived by people. We would like to thank Senator Fernando, and I would like, in the name of our commission and the TST, I would like to thank you for your speech, and I understand of your need to leave already, but we hope you can stay as long as possible. This week is a very active week for us in the Federal Senate. It's good to be this way. We are living now a sensation that we maybe had a disruptive movement of one of the decisions to try to rescue the right of the Brazilian workers and to allow them to be able to access labor law without the threat of having to take this test, where he has to take this test or pay an amount. And this is against the Constitution and definitely against the human rights. So it's good to see this perspective of human rights. I would like to thank you once more for your speech, and I will pass the floor now to our coordinator, to our friend, Dr. André Machado Cavalcante, so that he might be able to read and present our next panelist. President, thank you very much. I would like to ask for permission to say that the speech of Senator Contarato, whom I also happily call a friend, fills my heart with hope and happiness because of personal matters, not only mine, but many millions of people. Once again, thank you very much, Senator. And coming back to the program, I will read now the curriculum of Professor in Law and Vice Director of the Law School in the University. And she is a Scientific Coordinator of Labor Law and Vice Director of the Portuguese Association of Labor Law. And she's also a member of JUSGOV, the Center of Research of Government. And she works with human rights in the School of Human Rights in Domínio. I will now give the floor to Augusto César. Thank you once again. And now I invite the panel about security and health for the employee. I now give the word to Professor Dr. Teresa Coelho Moreira. Professor, the floor is yours, and I am excited to hear you. Thank you very much. Good morning. Good afternoon here on the other side of the Atlantic. First of all, I would like to thank this invitation, and I would like to congratulate for the event. It has been excellent. The panelist has been very good since day one. I would like to say hello, even be it digitally, to Minister César, which I met, I don't know if it was in Fortaleza or São Paulo, I don't remember, but it was in one of these places, or maybe even in Brasilia. I would like to say hello to Dr. Cavalcanti as well, one of my colleagues in this virtual table, Senator Fabiano, and I would also like to say that I was marveled by your speech. It was very interesting, very real, and very optimistic. And I was very in agreement with your last sentence. And this discrimination is very important to be talked about. And the new ways to be able to, for us to do our job. It's not because we're looking for new ways of working that there is no discrimination. It might just be less seen. I would also like to say hello to Cláudia Cardoso. We have the same last name. And now going to the theme, because we don't have a lot of time. Of course, that security at work is very important. And while we are living in a pandemic, even though it's getting better in some states, what's sure is that it's getting more and more important to treat mental health. And there are a lot of feelings, a lot of research about mental health in 2020. And it's going to be a not very positive scenario about the reality and the treatment of mental health in many states of the world that are part of the World Health Organization. Of 170, only 25% of the states take into consideration mental health. So it's fundamental of us to speak about this. On Mental Health Day, because there are a lot of mental health issues, we need to speak of the old ways of working. So we need to speak of these. And of these new ways of working, which are not only digitally, but which have increased a lot in the pandemic. We have been working, everybody has been working a lot on the digital platforms, which is called cloud work online. people working through apps, if we want to translate to English, has increased a lot, but also in the other modalities, which already had this, but increased. If we want to speak of home office, it could be, even though it's not the same situation. And many other issues have arisen in relation to safety for the employee and many other challenges. So what we try to avoid is the increase of physical risks and psychic risks. We can't forget that we have a lot of knowledge about what kind of changes we can bring and what can already make change in the short term. And the idea of having proactive policies that help in this new world of labor, this new digital world of labor, and the mental behavior and physical behavior and the problems that can come of these affect the behavior of the employee and the managing of the employees. And this is all data from before the pandemic. And I'm almost sure that the numbers are going to be different now in terms of the pandemic. 1 in 6 workers in Europe has already had a mental health issue. And this is pre-pandemic data. So we saw the incidence of all of this, and it brings social costs and economical cost. Of course, we can say that the new ways of working, there is a diminishing of the classic risks, of course, because of automation, many accidents can decrease. Of some workers who can, for example, be in a dangerous environment for less time. But what is sure is that the automation also brings many problems and other issues. They are all associated to a huge risk of the lack of transparency and the algorithms that can bring discrimination, which is one of the situations that is happening, and where there are also proposals in a couple of states to try to fight this type of discrimination, which exists and has many factors. And this will see today a couple of mental health issues that affect the 21st century worker. And we will speak of the physical nature of the workplace and the ways of working, how labor law came to be, and the necessity to always be online and available. And we'll also talk about activity and work. And this control increases a lot the stress levels of the employees. That's why nowadays we see a change in the psychosocial risks. This change in the type of work, in the location of the work, and the form of that the work is being managed. We always talk about the algorithms and how they are against this classic structure. But on the other hand, we are getting closer. Professional and social life is getting closer and closer. And with this control, it allows to be able to control not only the type of work, but also the time of the employee when he's not working and he's having his social life. So there are many risks that are increasing for the employees. But on the other hand, in these new forms of working, it's not continuous. So every activity is done and it increases the time as well. there is also precarity in the payment of the employees. And because this is so high, even after hearing the activity, it could be 0%. It was very little.
Não paga. E quem prestou a atividade, quem esteve, perdeu o tempo, por assim
The
dizer.
activity and
Por outro lado, também,
and on the other hand, the intensity of work, the deadlines that are very
sem quaisquer
short to carry
pausas,
out the same activities without any pauses, they create many problems and many risks for the physic and mind health.
trabalho são
And
externas.
that's why the costs are externalized for works, male and female workers. They cannot get sick because they're going to suffer the consequences of being sick. On the other hand, there is not enough education that in this workers' environment, because a lot of the activities are carried out through digital platforms, and they are
Como, por exemplo, a
these
construção.
activities that are very dangerous, such as transport, and nowadays even more.
Regulamentação ainda se tornam mais perigosas e piores.
This situation got even more dangerous, and also there is a possibility that is a lot higher of accidents, not only because of a structure, but also the lack of clarity and transparency and specifying what kind of work it's going to be carried out, the equipment, the clothing, and uniforms, and the security itself, the interruptions and the distractions with the alerts sent by cell phone, and if you work with digital platforms, have to look at. And you might be driving and you might have to use your cell phone to see what is the place, where it's the route that you have to take and where you should go to. So all of these alerts, they might cause a much higher number of workers or labor accidents, and that will affect the security of workers in this kind of work. And another aspect is the difficulty of concentration on these forms, because many times there are many factors that come together, and you have to remember the remote working. We have to remember this because a lot of us had to use remote working, and with the constant repetitions as well, and that might cause, and also sanctions during this, considering these distractions also for worker safety. And sometimes there is a lack of qualifications that are demanded by law for certain activities, and they continue carrying out this activity because cheap labor, there is cheap labor, and there are very few sanctions that can be applied. And definitely there are some sanctions are being put in place, but up to some time ago, we didn't have any sanctions. So we were trying to make the situation easier. So it's also necessary to be more proactive in identifying risks for health and of workers' health, and this constant change of work, that aspect of work. And it's important to anticipate changes in technology and digital technologies and that affect this kind of work and the type of control of work. And this anticipation has to be done through a continuous education. And this continuous education has to take place even before you consider the work sphere. For example, integrating of healthcare and in work and education in general. And just later on, at the workforce. So everybody will adapt better to risks, and the organization and the International Labor Organization has drawn attention to this. And that was in 2018, or way before the pandemic, that fell on our laps out of the blue, and that mentioned this universal right to education and training. There are some other forms of work and the division of work in micro tasks, and the disappearance of the regular position or job position generates a lot of insecurity for people who carry out these jobs, and they pose other risks for security of workers, the healthcare of workers. And through the fragmentation of the workers, they basically have to be looking for different activities. And they search to have a decent living or reasonable living that will allow them to live, actually to survive or get by in this reality. And this constant search for new activities with new demands, and it demands different education, and it implies in other risks also for these workers. On the other hand, and by reducing their salary or compensation, there is no respect for the time of work. The breaks between these shifts, they disappear, so they can increase their earnings and they can increase the salary. And there will be new risks posed for mind health. We're not talking about robots, we're talking about people. And that's why we cannot forget the first article of the Declaration of Philadelphia. And the ILO, it also said that the job is not a product and workers are not robots. And this is the other risk that is psychosocial and these new types of forms of works, which is to fulfill goals or to achieve targets. And under the penalty, and I'm going to use the terminology that the platforms use, and which is pretty shocking, and under the penalty of deactivation of workers or disconnection of working, which is the turning of humans into things, right? And people who work in platforms realize this: you were disconnected, you were deactivated from the platform because it didn't achieve your goals, because you were resting when you shouldn't have been resting. And even in the absence of this very clear demand, workers who work in these platforms, they feel that if they're not connected, they're not going to be chosen for the next tasks. And that's why they prefer to compromise their open or give up their break and to get such little compensation, even though it's very little. And workers cannot lose their lives when they are making money. And this is a principle of workers' rights. They are entitled to an effective break and not to be bothered constantly. They are also entitled to do this, to be disconnected, because you cannot forget to rest completely. You need both mind and physical rest, and the most important connections and human connections, they need some quality time without interruptions. And within the situation of human dignity, that's what's at stake here in this time, this break time, to try and disconnect for workers, male and female workers. And if they do not have this break, they'll have technological stress and they blur the lines between their family and work life. And these new ways of providing work, they might increase, and basically gender inequality. And because they interfere in private life, and it's really hard for people, and especially which is unpaid work. And these are basically women, right? Because these are mostly women who are responsible for this. And on the other hand, there is a huge a very strong competition between workers, and they have to compete to get the next task. Why? So they'll have better reputation if you work more. And it's basically a spiral of overloading of work to get another task, and they compete amongst each other so that they can get another task. They can the driver to get another task, and that caused a lot of problems for psychosocial problems, and the assessments that are performed as well. The assessments that are performed can create and generate the activation and from the platforms, and they are also discriminatory practices. And they're basically cyber harassment and people who work in digital platforms, and they can be extremely unfair because, since the evaluation is going down, or you have 4 stars in the assessment, they're not necessarily connected to the performance of the worker. It might be connected to factors that are discriminatory factors, and the gender of the person, the ethnicity or the race, sexual orientation, and age. All of these factors might play into a lesser assessment or a feedback, or they might even have lost cell phone service. There might be some storm, and then the delivery of the food would take longer than expected, and this will cause this deactivation. Of course, legally that is not possible for the general data protection law, and here in Europe we already have judgments that ban this automatic deactivation without human intervention, but technically that's possible. And another danger is to work with robots. The new robots became the supervisors of humans, and they work with them. And it causes physical danger, and also the management of algorithmic management, in the sense that work is even more and more coordinated by algorithms, and a lot of the management of human personnel, it goes through algorithmic management. And if we think that a mathematical model could be have much less bias because it's a neutral one, it's a statement that is completely disconnected to the reality, and they can be as prejudicious as people, and they have been generating discrimination in reality. And the problem is that it can increase the discriminatory bias and the people that are affected. The digital link of the algorithm has a much higher capacity than the human eye. And of course, for that, from the general data protection rights and the Brazilian rights, wants to stop this. That's why I have the possibility to do this. And also the principle of transparency. And it's called Black Box Society. And for this transparent society, and in order to end this, there is the possibility to improve this. And on the other hand, there have to be campaigns to try and demystify it, especially now during the pandemic. It's been happening. And And at the level of European Union, I just want to do two testimonies here. They're very simple. The resolution of the European Parliament and for workers in the platforms, it basically all of the workers of digital platforms have the right to receive compensation for diseases that are derived from working condition and they cause other problems. And the European consultation to social platform and digital platforms, and it's in the second stage now, and then in the first stage that ended in December now, and we hope that there will be another directive that will be issued by the European Union Parliament that mentions this. It's about to do with the working conditions and this way of providing services. And the Green Book of the Future of Work in Portugal also too approaches these issues and says that we need to update these safety roles and work for these new ways of providing work. And to conclude, the current challenge that we face now in these new forms to provide services is to give a practical attention for the traditional structures and to look at these new forms of work and that are generated by these new technologies and that are inherent, and especially to anticipate the risks of these new forms to provide work because of the consequences of the psychological diseases are huge, the consequence. And the social psychological risk has other consequences such as affecting the muscle, hypertension, and heart problems, burnout syndromes, and even it leads up to suicides. So that's why it's fundamental to invest in this security and work security and work health, remembering always one of the issues that the ILO mentioned, which was that health and security at work have to be recognized as fundamental rights for humans and for female and male workers. And even though it's an uncertain future, I cannot end on a negative note. I want to end on a positive note because I am an optimistic person. And even though in a situation like this, the pandemic, even though the reality has presented a lot of challenges and difficulties, all of entrepreneurs and social partners and employees, it's the time for them to make the most to create a future of work that is more healthy and safe for everyone. Thank you very much. Professor Teresa, in reality, your presentation was really important. So many important topics and so many important aspects, and considering the social psychological risks that are evident in these new forms of work, since starting with crowd working, with the expectation of working without considering that the micro task and that's why we would have unpaid work. And starting with a possible combination between crowd working and intermittent work, which is completely perverse because the intermittent work or temporary work was considered in 2006-17. It started in the Brazilian legislation, which is a bit different from the Portuguese experience. And it's something alarming. I would have a lot of things to remark on, but I have to, because the remarks and the comments will definitely be made at the end of the presentations, okay? Now I pass the floor to our coordinator, André Machado Cavalcante, so he can show the resume of Professor Ana Cláudia Cardoso. Thank you, Mr. President. I'd just like to say very quickly, it's just a few words. Justice Delair, you can say whatever you want, okay?
Bom dia a todos. Quero cumprimentar.
Good morning, everyone. I'd like to greet Judge André Machado and Justice Sebastião, he is my dear colleague, Justice Augusto César, and Professor Ana Cláudia, and my dear friend Teresa Coelho Moreira. I was thinking here, look at the combination here.
Teresa Coelho.
Justice Augusto César and Professor Teresa Coelho. So that is a perfect match, right? And very timely as well to think about these situations, the information that were brought by Dr. Teresa. And in Brazil and Portugal have a very similar situation concerning the labor issues here. There is a lot more vulnerability and precarious job here in Brazil concerning work, but we have always been partners on this fight to provide value to the justice, to labor justice. And I would like to just say this and you can go on. Okay, thank you very much, Professor Ana Cláudia, Professor Teresa too, and Justice Augusto César. I'm very pleased. And I would like to invite everyone who's here today for the panel tomorrow that is going to be the panel of celebrating 10 years of this program during the presentation that Justice Sebastião is going to make. I'm going to make the invitation to all of the justices here, and I would like to say it right now, actually. So is it 10 p.m., 10 a.m., Justice Sebastião? Yes. Yeah, he mentioned that it's going to be at 10 a.m. I already accepted the invitation. I don't know if I can be uninvited, okay? But on my part is okay. And the 10-year celebration will have another homage to Justice Dalazzi. Thank you very much, Minister Delaide. Now we'll pass the floor to André Cavalcante for to mention the curriculum, the resume of Ana Cláudia Cardoso.
Do currículo da doutora Ana Cláudia Cardoso.
And I'm going to read her curriculum here. And she is a doctor by the University of USP, and also she's a postdoctor in the Center of Studies of Politics in Brazil. She was a researcher and in the Brussels Institute, and she's also a professor at the University of Minas Gerais. She's currently a researcher in the Labor Studies Department and the Working Group of Digital Work and Monitoring of Labor Reform, HEMI. Now I'll pass the floor back to the president of the panel, Justice Augusto César.
Ministro, você está sem áudio.
Justice, you have. So, okay, now I can say it. So I thank Dr. André Machado Cavalcante for having read the resume of Dr. Ana Cláudia Moreira Cardoso. And now I will ask her to talk about the topic, the new ways of worsening the working relations and the risk for health and the work environment. You have the floor, Dr. Ana Cláudia. Good morning. I'd like to say, and I would like to invite and to thank for this program that was sent to us that has been discussed concerning the workers' health, and it's still invisible. You know, we still discuss labor organization, but workers' health is still not very present in the discussion. So congratulations for this wonderful program and all of the organization here. And thank you, coordinators of this panel. And I know that we are in an activity that is online, and I would like to say that I'm available for a next activity that it would probably be in person, but I think that nothing replaces our in-person discussions. The interesting aspect to say, to present almost at the end of the seminar. It's because many presentations were made and very broad discussions concerning the restructuring. And Teresa, I think that we almost did the same work together. It seems like we performed a very similar work and their presentations are similar. I'm going to share with you my presentation. Tell me if it's right, please, because that's always something I'm trying to put in the presentation mode, okay? All right then. So I decided, since there were many discussions that took place over the seminar, I talked to Leonardo and to try and focus more on the process of having platforms for work. And I had prepared a discussion of home office or actually remote working. And but this idea was already discussed too much. So I'm going to talk here presenting with considering a work that I had with the union, and I worked in GIS for over 26 years. That was a very long time. And I was also in Brussels in the A2E, and there were a lot of discussions with the union movement. And it was in 2017 that we started investing more and more in the labor platforms, and then sometimes in French we say the number economies, the economy of numbers. And I believe that's the discussion. What we realize is that we don't yet have enough data about the health conditions in terms of these platform companies. There have been studies that they are being carried out by Fiocruz and Fundacentro. But to make this presentation, of course, that I will base in field studies. I'll base it on field studies and dialogues of workers. And I am part of this WhatsApp group so that I can understand their realities. But we see, especially in Brazil, that the researchers are focused too much on the platforms of micro working, or in the individual work. And we see that platforms are basically in every sector of the economy nowadays. Another issue is, when I talk about work, I'm talking about these different aspects. When I'm going to analyze the work, I'm going to see how workers is being organized and the relations that are established between workers and their managers and bosses. What are the working conditions, whether these workers have autonomy and they actually participate in issues that are important, such as establishing the break, the goals, and when they are going to work or not. And we're talking about future perspectives. And the worker is living, and whenever he's working, he looks ahead and he says he's anxious or he's interested. So the work, considering all of these dimensions, are all of them determine in the process of disease. Here in Brazil, we have a research in GIS, and that starts with the data of PNAE. And they are identifying the profile of these workers from platforms. We also have some working incidents in considering the platforms for delivery of goods. And considering this group of information, it shows us what are the risk factors and social and psychosocial risk factors within work. And we see that they're very evident and very evidently that they're very similar to traditional companies. But besides the issues that were already present, there is a plus, which is the gamification of management by algorithms with an increase of control, because they're companies like any other ones. They're not technology companies and intermediation companies. They are companies that employ, such as Uber is similar to Volkswagen, and such as Walmart as well. And the difference is that they try and tell us that they're not workers, that they're not employers. So the idea to carry out this analysis from the psychosocial risks that present the physical risks and the social and the social risks and the mental risks as well. These are important. And when I mention this concept, I say maybe work is determined as and the focus on capitalism is generating problems or healthcare problems and illnesses. But of course that we cannot hold a very thorough discussion, but the idea is to have a legislation and a national and macro-national plan as well, and the international as well. There are some other indicators too, but you can see that they're the same items that I mentioned in the previous slides. So you have a broadened view or panorama of work. And the idea of this work is to say, if I want safe work, secure work, and I want to stop workers from getting ill, I have to change the way job is carried out. So the idea is to break away from this narrative that blames workers for their illnesses. Of course, I'm not going to get into details about what we call the organization of 4.0 industry, but I'm going to look specifically at a business model of digital platforms, because there is a very important movement in the capital, which is to make it external. And it's not only to make the production external, but you also externalize responsibility and cost as well. There are many ways to externalize this, and one of them, and probably the worst one, I hope that there won't be a worse one in the future, but the last one in the platform work is because this company started saying, you know what, I'm not an employer, I don't have workers, I don't have, and there are no rights, basically. That's basically it, you know? And we see we're working a lot by looking at the website of platforms to see how they present themselves. And this platform here that will provide service, they are enthusiasts of bricolage, are carrying out this service.
And under their full responsibility, that Supermano is not an employer and does not have responsibility for its employees, and it's not responsible for the result of the work. So we ask ourselves, how did they grow so fast, so much? Because there is a combination of factors, because or else we end up having this technical determinism, right? The technology doesn't determine, it gives you possibility. It can be used for many things. So we have this combination of factors, these neoliberal policies, technology and ideology. Very quickly, just to show you a little bit how there are already many platforms that unfortunately sometimes we still look to only a couple, especially in delivery sector. I'm sorry, everyone. My throat is dry. The air conditioner here. Anyways, we have many models. We have what we call platform industry of digital work by demand, where the work is doing by demand and it's delivered locally. So there's the transportation and the delivery, which we also already know. Hotels, cleaning services, waiters, real estate, transportation, construction, and continuing. So all these sectors already have a platform. Another one, which is also a digital work by demand, but it's the results of the work is delivered online. For example, translation, production of texts, and what we call micro work, which are these food platforms which use AI. The technology businesses that are traditional companies, Goodyear, instead of making their own technological product, they go into a platform and put what they want. And on the other side, you have many employees who are waiting for this task to be able to answer. And what we also call click farms, which clients that are looking for platforms where there are employees who like their blogs or their social media posts. In Brazil's case, as I said before, the data coming from here, this data is only until 2019, because from PNAD de Contínua until in 2020 hasn't been released yet. So what we realize is that from 2012 to 2019, there was an increase of 54% in employees in these work platforms. In 2009, there was estimated 4,200 people at their main work. So 4.5% of the people that have this type of work as their main work, which would be about 4.5% of the entire employed people. And I'm sure that if we redo this calculation in the context of the pandemic, this will have increased. We also see that it's in all the sectors. In education still has 4.4%, but we know that it increased. And this shows us that that initial idea of that the platforms would only reproduce this work that already exists, we see that this assessment was not correct, because the platforms already since 2016, 2015 have been colonizing these sectors which were not characterized by this type of work. So we realize that we have a profile that's more the same, and for the employees, be it for people with low education or a lot of education, older people, younger people, or people from any ethnicity. So all of these employees are already working in work platforms. So there's a very big diversity of platforms with different logic. Of course, there are similarities. This digital infrastructure makes it able for you to control this work. And another very important, this idea about these processes and the gamification and algorithms and the appropriation of processes of the data of the users and employees. We won't be able to get into all of these discussions, but two issues The one about the legislation, that the workers aren't entitled to anything, to any right. And there are the industries that define all the rules. It's subordination, it's very evident. And most decisions in the regional courts still don't recognize this subordination, but it's evident. The employees need to take all the risks and have to manage their own social safety and their own security and health. So when we're talking about safe work, how do we talk about it in a context like this? The gamification management is one of the factors that generates the most risk, because it's a type of management that is opaque, it changes all the time, exactly for society and the employees, so that they don't understand how this type of management works. And from there, the same way that we have goals in the traditional companies, in these platform companies, we also have goals, but they appear neatly as if it was a game, but there is no game, but they appear as if they were. So, oh, there's competition and ranking and a prize, but with all that, with the only intention not to make them, not to have them go further than their limits. A lot of research is showing, as Dr. Teresa has said, that workers know that the more you are connected, the more chance you have to get demand. And so all of the companies don't take responsibility, because they say, oh, you see, the algorithm fired and suspended and gave a punishment. It wasn't us. Here are a couple of data about work accidents. Here, oh, I didn't put here, but it's platform companies with demand, with delivery. So we are seeing here, we're still in the beginning of the pandemic. Imagine that this data, of course, nowadays is much worse. So we show that 90% of these paid indemnizations are to motorcycle riders. 82% of the people going to the hospital is 82% motorbikes. And of course, the total cost and the deaths. So we ask, who pays for this? Because the companies get money, we know this. But who pays for this? The worker, his family, and us. Me, you, and each one of us. I will speak very quickly here of the profile, because the profile is very different in each platform, as I said before. So we're not able to generalize, but here is one example. If we take the delivery companies, we know that there are young men, black, poor, and with not a lot of formal education. The biggest part of the field research, which we don't have these national research, but they show that a good part of the employees go into these platforms because they were unemployed, and that is their only way of getting money. So we can't call it a moon or something like that. So there are very long schedules as well. Since there are a lot of platforms, we see that there's a lot of diversity in a day of work. So generally, I'm talking here in the delivery platforms and transportation companies, we see that they are long work days every day of the week. So we can't say that it's not a full-time job, 7 days a week, and the salary is low and has gotten worse, which has happened in the pandemic. There is a lot of discussion about the child labor of the labor organ. We've already talked a lot about this because it's very easy for employees to sign up. It's very easy for a 14-year-old, 13-year-old, 15-year-old worker to go into the job market. Here we have a couple of quotes. I think I have 8 minutes left. So here we see that they are telling us to ride a bike in the middle of the road, you need to pay a lot of attention, and at the same time you have to be conscious of the information of the app. The person has a feeling of defeat when he is not able to do it and he has to go back. Another sentence, the lack of work demands a lot from your psychological being. And there are a lot of delivery drivers with depressions because they're full of debt and they are not able to pay their things. It's also very uncertain when they get paid. Here is another quote, which they are always very harsh. A worker that said he already helped at an accident. And what we see is that the body really gets destroyed on the road. So this is something that I really get scared of. So we need to think about this, what it really works, what it really means to work with fear in relation to everything, your salary, your day of work, and your life. Here there is a study which was done by the Institut Nacional de Recherche et de Sécurité da França, which brings the discussion of the risks and taking a look at all the indicators of psychosocial risk and showing how the employees and these platform companies are submitted to these high issues and risks because the demands are very high, the physical and the emotional ones. And there is a total invasion of the work day into your social life. Autonomy is minimal. Why? Because if you try to be autonomous, it means that you'll receive negative assessments and you will be fired from the platform, so you will be unemployed. The social relations are very fragile. The employees feel very isolated and compete a lot between each other in the question of who will get this demand. There is a lot of values in conflict because they feel like their work is not valued, and there's a lot of insecurity. So what we realize is this hyper-exploration and ultra-flexibilization of the employee. These are things that have already been talked about by Teresa. So a lot of ergonomic problems. It increases the risk factors and accidents because these employees do not have formations. The salary is low and also unsure, so that people have an insecurity in relation to their job because people don't know if they're going to work tomorrow. So I would have to work as much as possible today. All the time is time for work or to be available or connected. So there's this breach of the borders between work and social life, which is very important. And also the intensification of work, which you get less breaks, more work, and it can give you chronic fatigue. And this idea of lacking of feeling like you are in a group, which we know is not good for the motivation of the employee. And quickly, I wanted to show you what we talked about here in delivery platforms, so we see that there are things like bathrooms and drinkable water. Imagine this, in 2021, employees still have to ask for this. The issue of aid in food and the end of firing without a cause, because he gets fired and he can't even argue against and find out why he was fired. So this transparency in the rules is very important. The possibility of dialogue, because there is a lack of that. There is also a high moment of sexual harassment, and
geral. Então, é que tem uma mistura de novas e velhas.
So there is a mix of all these practical ideas that unfortunately, generally, are still being accepted institutionally, and we need to speak about a new type of this type of labor and policies that make it able so that we can still use these ideas and companies cannot take advantage of their employees, especially because it creates these triangular relations that are hidden between the client and the platform and the company. The employee sees himself as a client. The platform says it does the service for the employee. So definitely this is a big confusion, and it shows in any company the need to regulate all these issues. And in Brazil's case, we don't really have to create legislation because we already have it. We have the federal constitution, Article 7th, which makes it clear that the labor protection is not exclusive of the juridical form of jobs, but we also have it in our labor law. And we know that in this context, in this global context, but especially in the Brazilian context, where the workers are only losing their rights, we know that any legislation that is created in this moment will be worse than what we already have. Isn't that correct? So we will create, if it's our intention, second-class employees, because definitely legislation isn't going to be created that is better. And we already see that the platforms are in all of the sectors and areas. So what's the idea? Oh, let's make legislation for the delivery platform companies, another one for in the judicial area, another one in the transportation department. It doesn't make any sense. How does this work? We have the basic rules, and then in the negotiation process, I'm going to talk about the specific parts of each sector. Because of course, there will be issues that we have to put in our labor law, because we need to talk about this algorithmic bias and everything. And especially if I create legislations that are worse, the companies will say, wait a minute, then I will close my company and open a platform company. Why would I continue to pay for my rights if I can have the same process by creating a platform company? So this is a very important discussion. We have many international decisions which recognize this bond between and the relation between the employers and the employees. And I think that this is essential if we really want to build a decent and dignified and safe work. And that's it. Thank you very much. Professor Ana Cláudia, I am totally convinced that the family Moreira has some center of enlightenment in the middle of the Atlantic, far from the Isle of La Palma, because it's your ideas are always very constructive. So we don't want to share this horrible feeling that Spanish people are feeling nowadays. But thank you, Ana Cláudia. As I said before, in the beginning of our panel, in harmony with Professor Teresa Moreira, and now I can say definitely that the recognizing itself of Ana Cláudia is very important. And it was very important, the speech about the work conditions and of the people that turn ill. We need to revisit this. And this very frequent try to externalize everything in relation to the responsibility and the management and the cost, and this questioning about this technical determinism. What is this technical determinism if the platforms can be made as a means? They don't define our posture and our conduct, especially from the political actors who are responsible for these regulations, as they have referenced the movement in the EU. I remember a couple of years ago, there was an academic posture that we saw as ethic values that needs to be taken into consideration, that we called an artificial intelligence that can be trusted, which gave a lot of solidity so that this tool can be efficient and to guarantee not only that there would be a regulatory milestone, which is also a very important question, because a lot of people say that Article 7 does not apply if it's related to AI, only when it's in relation to a decision made by a person, which is just like Dr. Teresa said, a way to make the employee, to put him on the same level as the machine. And in this other universe where AI is what conceives the goals to be achieved, as if there wasn't a human behind that, which is where this algorithmic bias comes from. And it's this algorithm that rewards, and this is a risk that I realize very clearly. Even though we have a lot of virtues, we have made a lot of changes in 2008, because it was written that this review of these decisions, of these automated decisions, would come from a person. And what do they mean with that? What did they suggest? They don't have the right that the person that gave birth to this algorithm presents himself and has to explain why he is discriminating vulnerable people. So we are in a very delicate moment, and this moment turns even more delicate now, because all of this legislative process that I know of and which advances has as a basic premise that the relation between the work relationship, and there are many studies speaking of this, not only from Professor Ana Cláudia, but also many others, but also Professor Rodrigo Carrieri. So there are many academics that have been showing how many courts of many different countries, how they are all changing this milestone to give this basic protection which would go generically to all the urban and rural employees. And even if that is under an algorithm which has been made to create and to be able to make a platform work. So I would have many comments to make, but what I really would like is to say how happy I am, which I'm sure everybody who's watching is also. I got many messages here already on my WhatsApp during the presentations, and they're always in the same direction to highlight this manifestation of Professor Teresa and Ana Cláudia, and in the beginning, that great speech from Senator Fabiano Contarato. I would also like to thank Professor Delaida Miranda Arantes for this possibility, and I communicated to the ceremonial master that I'm needed in another institutional scheduling that has been wanting my participation since 10:30. I would love to continue here, and I will watch the video if I can. And I would like to have this ending participation with the proposals of the questions that will be made. But I will now have to become absent and give the coordination of the presentations to the most competent Dr. André Machado Cavalcante. And I'm sure that this rest of the panel will be enriching just as well. Thank you very much for the possibility to be able to participate. And I wish for this program a long life, an eternal life, and to continue to enrich our dialogues and our interactions with this academic means that help us understand how Brazil, be it automated or mechanized, would work, and why we are champions in work accidents, and to understand the political actors in this process. Thank you very much. I now say goodbye, and I'll pass the word to Justice André Machado Cavalcante. Thank you very much.
E até breve.
Thank you, Mr. President. Have a good day, good work today.
Aqui na condução dos
And
trabalhos.
now I'm going to take over from you to conduct the works. And besides the questions that were made,
Dirigidas à doutora
and
Teresa.
I'm going to address the first question for Dr. Teresa Coelho. And the first one was Mr. Valdoino Cunha. And he says, the new ways of providing work have demanded too much out of the workers, and they caused psychological diseases and other problems as well, because after this work, if she prefers, no, I can do this. I can do it this way. Thank you very much. First, I would like to greet Justice Augusto Cesar, who had to leave, and Professor Ana Cláudia Cardoso. We didn't arrange or that we were in synchrony, in complete synchrony, even though we have the same surname. So we were in synchrony, and be it in France and in the institutes that we studied together. I don't know if you're going to be in the conference for next week. It's going to be very interesting. So going straight to the issue, thank you for all the questions and all the remarks. I'd like to give you congratulations for the conduction of Cunha, and this situation to the new kind of work that are being created. they were mentioned, Professor Ana Cláudia, they say that it's very friendly and they seem, and it's basically like they always show the bright side of life, but there is also the dark side, you know, which is the most obscure and it's not shown, but has caused for a lot of workers, and Professor Ana Cláudia has already mentioned this. It's not the work of gig economy and you have a main job and after that it's like a side job. You know, for a lot of people, it is the main income. And because it is the main income, they can be left out of job without making any money out of the blue. And sometimes they receive, they make very little money. And people basically have to work continuously. For example, as drivers, they work almost 80 hours a week. And 80 hours, you have to be connected. You cannot forget that all the time that they're not connected in the sense that they, with the application on, but they're not driving or taking food anywhere, but they have to be on. And this time is doesn't count in terms of payment, but they get exhausted. They cannot conciliate their professional life and their work life. They have to compete extenuously, and that's why there is, and then I agree with Dr. Aldo, it is basically superhuman can work, and this situation of not disconnecting, and it's not only in the platforms, also the digital platforms. This is also happening in traditional means of working. It's called FOMO, which in English means fear of missing out. That is like a serious, like, and the worker, and who's not connected 24 hours a day, it's going to disappear. And there will be another competition and there will be another person that will be connected. You know? And because if I'm not connected, we have another person will be, and I have to be connected so I can get the new task. And that clearly, we're talking about people, and we cannot forget about this, that behind the task, there is a person, and the person that brings us food, or the people who bring food to us and make food. There is a person, and that person is entitled to rest, and they should have rights to conciliate their personal and their work life too. They are entitled to periodic vacation time. They're entitled to be unionized or not. That's something that in the platforms it basically doesn't exist. And we cannot forget this. It's a sentence of a Portuguese legal expert that he says that basically summarizes the situation. So workers' right is the result of the solidary man and not the solitary man. And the digital platform basically wants to create the solitary man, with the person who works 24 hours a day, and after that will have huge problems in a personal level and psychological level and physical level. And companies cannot think only on profits, but they have to think the middle term. In the long term, they will have serious psychological problems to these people, and some specific companies have a specific department in this respect, and major platforms don't have this. And by considering this directive of the European Union, and so the one in which the people here in Portugal, they're called the riders, you know, and so that these companies will also have to start thinking about the consequences. and in defending workers' rights and this dignified work. Thank you very much.
Doutora Tereza, nós temos aqui outro
Thank
questionamento.
you, Dr. Teresa. There is another question here.
O juiz Leonardo
It's
Vandelli.
Judge Leonardo Vandelli that says whether labor rights or worker rights regulates
A duração, as
the
formas,
payment and the period of time and
o
kind of,
conteúdo e os
it does regulate the period and the way, but it regulates or
Trabalho.
doesn't
Não há-
mention much about the ways to organize the work. Isn't there a gap in our work? Let me break a little bit the protocol, and I'd like to greet Dr. Eduardo Landening and also to greet him for the event. Considering the issue, which is very important, you can leave it open, this regulation, because you think that it belongs to the employer, this power, and that this power was before the algorithm and the digital era too. And what people are fighting for is the need to regulate this situation, the new type of management, because the management involves a lot of artificial intelligence, and the companies know this. There are very recent studies that say that by selecting workers and the progression of the career,
mais problemático, mas que recorrem muitas vezes
that there is a decision that is made by an algorithm, and sometimes it was supposed to be neutral, but it was shown not to be anymore. And there is legislation, and the Spanish legislation was the first one dealing with that, to the royal decree, and it became a law. It was passed into law, and it talked about the workers' committees to know how algorithms work, the transparency, and to be consulted. And the idea is, and in Portugal, I can know this, there is a specific legislation regarding this. The workers have to be informed how algorithms work and how the management is made. And on the other hand, we can also use the LGPD in Brazil, the General Data Protection Rights, and and the role in collective hiring too is very important in regulating the situation, so that this gap will no longer exist in our legal framework, and we have to work on this. Because if there is this wasn't a possibility a few years ago, the digitalization also of the control, the automation of control of specific tasks to be automated, but the supervisor and the controller and the person and the boss to be a machine, that was not previously thought about. Apart from sci-fi movies, and I usually joke around saying that in James Bond movies too. So, and this will be reflected, is advancing much faster than the law, and the law is trying to catch up with it. And now we're confronted with a situation in which new supervisors are machines themselves. And for people not to be turned into things, and for machines not to be turned into gods or humans, we have to regulate this. And we also have the hiring of regulation and the legislation that is already in effect. And that's a gap that has to be plugged, definitely. Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Teresa, for the final explanations, for honoring us with such an important debate and this warning. So we have to be careful about it. Now I'm going to pass the floor to ask the questions that are addressed to Dr. Ana Cláudia. Can I, please, can you read? Can you read both questions, because they're very well connected? First one that Dr. Carolina Pazdemi asked Professor Ana Cláudia, can you say how the apps work with the new discussion of autonomy and the digital platforms, and please. And so what kind of society this kind of work is going to work with? Who's going to pay for the precarious aspects that are being created by the situation? These are the two questions that were addressed to you, Ms. And
Obrigada. Bom, eu vou invadir um pouco a questão anterior.
I'm going to talk a little bit about this, the issue that was mentioned before, because that is an issue that is even more serious in Brazil, Teresa, because the organization and the management of work was always planned by capital as a private organization. So all of the pressure and their representatives to discuss, even in innovation, technological innovation process, for example, in many processes in countries around Europe, people would sit down and discuss the consequences of the technological innovation, what the consequences it would bring to these workers. And here there are very few professional categories, and they're very specific ones with industry workers, steel workers, and the car industry. And intensity is rarely discussed, and the legislation also. And for example, our NREs, which are regulation rules, the very few ones that exist, they're being destroyed. And until we understand that for us to think about health, and we have to discuss collectively the management of work, we will continue defining tools for individual protections, and we're going to think that that's enough, because workers are the ones who have to live through work. They need a space for discussion. So how do they live and their works, and how their work could be organized, and what's the best time for a break, okay? And that is the conception that we have. And this idea, the worker is essential, and that is something really important. Concerning the breaks, I think that every action of workers, every action is necessary and important, but that it doesn't suffice. We have international monopolies. These digital platforms are extremely powerful. And if we consider the Airbnb platform and what it's doing throughout the world, this is an absurd situation. They have too much power. Of course, that the action of workers is extremely important, but by itself, it won't suffice. So we do need the continuity, and they are basically explaining, and there have been some strikes that are taking 5 or 7 days, and that is important. And what we see in the country, in Brazil, the public prosecution service or the general attorney's service has had a very important role, but we do need more. We need congressmen to look at it with a broad perspective. They should not just consider the companies that deliver food and products, and they have to understand that it's a shift in the economy that is taking place. So we have to think long term. I don't know exactly how, but of course that academia has a very important role in this, which is try to remove the veil from this false discussion or false argument, which is entrepreneurship and it's a technological company. So there are all of the stakeholders have to work in tandem to fight the situation, or else we're going to get a society sicker and sicker. We'll have society that is more and that's sicker and sicker and more unequal. more and more prejudicious, because companies, they only consider short-term periods. So that's why the state has to look at the long term, and society with the state, and say, you know what, up to this point you can do this, and after that you cannot. But when the state starts thinking just short term and play the long and to remove workers' right and not to include these new workers and the rights that were provided by laws, that is a very complicated situation. So, and then we get back to the initial discussion, which is a huge increase in inequality. We're going to continue to have death, and we will never have a big enough consumer market, and companies themselves, because even though inequality is, there is a limit for people who are extremely rich to consume. You know, how do I increase consumer market? I increase minimum wage, I increase formal markets, and then I limit the workload and work time, besides investing, of course, and that's something that Brazil is not doing, which is investing in technological innovation, because in the context of 4.0 industry, we're always going to serve other countries. So that is a very broad discussion, and my final remark, and that I think that is important to mention, is it's not in the context within the digital platforms, but this was already a situation before, from the late 90s, which is the issue of connection. That is essential. And of course, how people use since they use their cell phones to use, people use their cell phone all the time, they think it is natural to be available for work all day long. And then maybe there is a CNA worker, and then he gets a message by saying that he didn't achieve his target, and he didn't fulfill his target. So he receives a message and say, what are you going to do to get to the target? So we have to think about the right to disconnect from work during the time which the person is not working. So thank you very much for this opportunity. I was very happy because this perspective, considering the health of workers, or workers' health, it's extremely important. And I do congratulate you for your program, and I thank you for your invitation. We thank you, Dr. Ana Cláudia, Dr. Ana Teresa, for the wealth of the information of the discussion, and continuing with this seminar that is shedding so much light on the issue of a decent work. We thank you both. And this is the last part of the panel. And now the Master of Ceremonies will have the floor.
Em instantes, daremos continuidade.
In a few minutes, we're going to continue with the event.
Você já pensou em quanto tempo fica online todos os dias? Em média, o brasileiro passa 9 horas e 17 minutos conectado à internet diariamente. O país ocupa o 3º lugar no ranking mundial. O excesso de informação pode gerar ansiedade, depressão, cansaço e afetar o processo de tomada de decisão. É a chamada infodemia. O problema é ainda mais grave no contexto de pandemia do novo coronavírus. Selecione bem o conteúdo que você acessa. Verifique a origem das informações que recebe. Não contribua para a desinformação. A construção do trabalho seguro depende de todos nós. Uma campanha pela valorização da saúde mental no trabalho.
Você sabe o que é trabalho decente? Trabalho decente é o direito ao trabalho produtivo e de qualidade para todos, promovendo a liberdade, igualdade, segurança e dignidade humanas. Ele firma conquistas sociais e combate discriminações no ambiente de trabalho, além de promover o desenvolvimento inclusivo e sustentável. O trabalho é um direito fundamental e deve ser um instrumento de promoção do bem-estar social, busca pela superação da pobreza e redução de desigualdades. Cumpra as leis trabalhistas na sua empresa. Realize ações de promoção da igualdade de gênero e etnia. Promova condições de trabalho saudáveis. A construção do trabalho seguro depende de todos nós. Uma campanha pela valorização da saúde mental no trabalho.
Vivenciamos uma mudança de contexto. Novos conceitos surgiram e com eles novos conflitos. O momento pede cooperação, que trabalhemos juntos. A construção do trabalho seguro depende de todos nós. Em conjunto, uma campanha pela valorização da saúde mental no trabalho.
A pandemia foi um divisor de águas, né?
Não poder estender a mão para um amigo para apertar a mão dele é estranho, né?
A primeira coisa que eu vou fazer, e quando eu tiver sentir a segurança mesmo de todos, é fazer um grande churrasco.
Quando tudo acabar, eu quero dar um abraço bem grande, bem gostoso em todos.
Eu vou aglomerar com minhas famílias e meus amigos. A primeira coisa que eu vou fazer é isso.
Qual foi o maior desafio profissional que vocês enfrentaram nessa pandemia?
A gente está 100% home office, tem um filho pequeno, então para se adequar a esse novo normal foi um pouquinho complicado.
Quando veio a pandemia, a gente precisou desenvolver uma maneira de perder o medo, né? Segurar a onda desse medo e procurar a cada dia entender melhor com o que a gente estava lidando.
A pandemia não me permitiu ter folga, férias ou descanso, porque a gente que tem família e a gente que tem colaboradores que fazem parte do nosso quadro, a gente é perseguido pela responsabilidade.
O que tem ajudado vocês a superarem este desafio?
A esperança de dias melhores. O acreditar na ciência, que a vacina vai funcionar, que vai chegar para todo mundo.
Ter ficado mais próximo da minha família, né?
O crescimento foi a melhor parte disso tudo para que a gente pudesse se reinventar.
E como cada um pode contribuir para um ambiente de trabalho mais saudável?
Se a gente quer conservar a nossa sobrevivência, a melhor forma é cuidar dentro do ambiente de trabalho.
A gente teve que mudar a nossa rotina, né? Que questão de higiene pessoal, esses negócios, mas o que eu vejo mesmo é o isolamento social.
Com um acompanhamento, a liderança tem acompanhado muito de perto, acompanhado a questão psicológica de cada um, entendeu? Eles se preocuparam em estar dando treinamentos, em falar sobre a importância de usar EPIs.
Qual recado vocês dariam para os profissionais que estão enfrentando essas dificuldades, assim como vocês?
A gente tem que ter a perseverança, a resiliência e nunca perder a fé ou a determinação de achar algo para se reencontrar.
Eu espero que termine logo essa pandemia, e que o mais rápido possível a gente possa voltar, né? Assistir um jogo de futebol no estádio e aprender a ser pessoas melhores, né?
Não percam a esperança, não percam a fé, porque isso tudo vai passar e a gente vai ter dias melhores.
Senhores, dando
Ladies and gentlemen, continuing with the event, we're going to present the conference Future of Work and Well-being of Workers and Organizations during and after pandemic. Remotely, the panelist members are part of the panel. The president of the panel, Maria Aparecida Gurgel, Deputy Prosecutor of the Labor Prosecutor Service. As the coordinator of the panel, Dr. Lorena de Mello Resende Gurnado, and a labor judge, and the manager of the Safe Work program. As the conference speaker, Ms. Dr. Marnie Dobson, Associate Director of the Social Epidemiology Center in California in the United States. And with the floor, Dr. Maria Aparecida Gurgel.
Obrigada. Bom dia.
Thank you very much, everyone. And I'm the Deputy Prosecutor of Labor Rights, and I'm a white person. I have short white hair, and I'm 62 years old. I'm wearing glasses. I'm wearing a dark clothes, and behind me there is a bookcase with a few books, and I'm in my home office. This small auto description is for everyone who cannot see or have seeing problems with their eyesight who are attending the event. I salute all of the panelists and the attendees here, and especially Dr. Lorena Resende Mello, labor judge from the and the conference speaker, Dr. Marnie Dobson. And I also have to thank my dear friend, Justice Maria Adelaide, who invited us to preside the panel. And at the same time, I would like to say that I'm available and to Dr. Lorena, especially because being here, we can learn. And I believe that's our most important goal. And I thank on behalf of the prosecution service of Labor Prosecution Service. And now I'll pass the floor to Dr. Lorena, who is going to continue now. Good morning, everyone. I greet everyone on behalf of Maria Aparecida Gurgel and our national manager, Dr. and Justice Adelaide Arantes, and also our regional manager, Dr. Sebastião, and the manager of the Southeast region, and Dr. Ibrahim Ivamonte from our regional consultant group. I'm going to make an audio description, very brief. I am a white woman and with long hair, brown hair. I'm wearing a pink blouse as in honor of the Pink October concerning breast cancer. And after this presentation, I'm going to present our speaker, Dr. Marnie Dobson, who is a postdoctorate, and she is the Associate Director of the Epidemiology Center of California. Her researches focus on gender and work, emotional work, and labor organization and psychosocial stressing factors and health results, mental health results, which is important for the United States and for the rest of the world as well. Dr. Marnie Dobson is the co-editor and author and contributing author of the new book, Unhealthy Work, Causes, Consequences, Cures, and which has a Portuguese translated, not official yet, Trabalho Insalubre, Causas, Consequências e Curas. And we're very eager for your presentation, Dr. Marnie Dobson. Now I'm going to pass the floor back to the president of the panel, Dr. Aparecida Gurgel.
Obrigada, doutora Lorena.
Thank you, Dr. Lorena. Without any further ado, I'm going to pass the floor to Dr. Marnie Dobson. And as Dr. Lorena mentioned, we're very eager to hear you.
Hi, good morning. It's lovely to be here. I'm delighted to be here, and I feel very privileged to be able to share these ideas and discussions. I wish I could do it in Portuguese. My apologies, but you know, I'm a big fan of Brazil. I was able to be there almost 2 years ago now. In 2019, I presented at a conference in Sao Paulo, which was wonderful, and I had such a lovely time, and I just can't believe how much the world has changed since 2019, especially in terms of, you know, its impact on work and working people over the last 2 years. So I'm delighted to be part of the 6th International Seminar on Safe Work. I am an occupational health researcher, an academic, so one of the stakeholders among many that are dedicated to understanding and really engaging with working people on how to improve work and health and safety. I think the idea of building safe and decent work has really met its time. I know in the United States, for example, there's a big movement around decent work, and you know, we can talk about what that means, but as an occupational health researcher, decent work is about respect, it's about dignity, and it's also about having good health, making sure that you are working in an environment that doesn't make you sick. And that's something that obviously we've spent a lot of time understanding and investigating in my field in occupational health research and in work stress research. So I'm very happy to be here. I'm going to talk a little bit, first of all, about the here we go. I want to first acknowledge my team, and I do work with my colleagues in various parts of the world. I'm in Los Angeles, California. I work with a colleague at the Center for Social Epidemiology, which is a nonprofit research organization that was founded by my good colleague, Dr. Peter Schnall. We work with Dr. Paul Landsbergis, who's in New York City, and Pooran Fagri, who is right now at the School of Public Health at UCLA in Los Angeles, and Dr. Bong-Kyu Choi, who is currently in South Korea. So we've worked together for many years now on various projects with working people, understanding the impact of work stress in the work environment on health. So I want to talk about COVID-19. I'm sure we've all been thinking and talking about it a lot for the last year and a half. As COVID-19 hit, we were launching a healthy work campaign. And we really struggled in the beginning with the relevance of healthy work during this global pandemic, which is of historic proportions. You know, what does healthy work mean when people are exposed to a deadly infectious disease, which we haven't had really to deal with ever before to this scale. So COVID-19 itself has had an impact on work, and I'm going to talk a little bit about those things and what that means for the future of work, because I think the pandemic is going to have a long-lasting effect on work and workers. And then I want to talk about work stress and the reality that it has been a pre-existing pandemic for many, many decades in the United States as well as globally. What do we mean by work stressors, and what do we know about COVID-19 and its impact on work stress? There is a connection there because we know that work stress can contribute to the comorbidities that we know, for example, make COVID-19 a more severe illness. The consequences of these work stressors on health are very well documented. There's maybe 2 decades, 3 decades now of research in occupational epidemiology that show a relationship between these specific kinds of work stresses, including things like high job demands and low job control, what we call effort reward imbalance, which is a theoretical model about the impact of people who are working very hard, putting a lot of effort in, but the rewards don't match with that level of effort. There's an inadequate balance between rewards, including financial rewards, wages, but also status and so on. And that these particular models do have an impact and contribute to cardiovascular disease, to depression, and to other chronic diseases. So what we know is that work stress plays a role in the chronic disease burden. So we're going to talk about that and why it's so important now, especially given this pandemic, which has highlighted so much inequality in terms of health. What we do going forward to begin to address and prevent and improve work. And then lastly, I'm going to talk a little bit about the different strategies there are, the different levels of intervention that we have to address work stress that are in place in the United States, and I'm sure in Brazil and globally. And how much more there is to do, because we don't really understand, and we sort of think stress is ubiquitous. Everyone has it. What's the big deal? People need to meditate and so forth. What we want to do is understand that work stress is a function of the way work is organized, and if we can address the sources of stress, then we can prevent its effects before it happens. And that really is how it's tied into the idea of decent work. So the pandemic has been obviously a major issue confronting the world for the last year and a half or more now. I think recently we were up to 35 million cases worldwide, and I think we're creeping closer to 5 million deaths, which is obviously of historic proportions. So what is the impact of COVID-19 on work? COVID impacts work and workers, and it's not equal. And what do I mean by that? We have had over 700,000 deaths in the United States, which is absolutely horrifying in a high-income developed world. We know we have one of the highest death rates globally. Unfortunately, many of those deaths have been among workers of color in low-income jobs, and I'm going to talk about that kind of inequality in a moment. But also COVID-19 has had an impact on millions of workers because of the public health lockdowns, which we know. It's caused unemployment, layoffs, reductions in work hours, businesses closed down. Obviously, unemployment and loss of income are major stressors in people's lives. And the unfortunate effects of the public health lockdowns have had their own impacts on people's health and well-being. Also, a major change and shift was the shift to what we call remote work or working from home. We know this happened mostly among higher income workers, and that many workers were not ever able to work from home. What we call in the United States came to call them essential workers, people who were doing jobs that were essential to the health and well-being of the economy and of the population. Essential workers went to work on the front lines, and they were much more likely to be exposed to the virus at work as well as in transit. And as I said, the deaths and severe illness in the United States have not been equal. They're much higher among our African American communities, our Latin Hispanic communities, and especially because these communities are also more likely to be low income essential workers. So what is the impact, first of all, of remote work on the health and well-being of those that have shifted to working at home? 37% of workers in the United States had switched to telework or remote work because of the pandemic. Now some estimates put that population at about 25% remain working at home and will remain working at home through 2021. Globally, at the start of the pandemic, about 1 in 5 workers worked from home. But in the United States, 73% of those with annual incomes, people who are working, who had incomes over $200,000 a year, were more likely to work remotely, compared to 12.7% with annual incomes less than $25,000. So you can see that obviously higher income workers were much more likely to be able to work from home and get the benefits of that, which is of course less exposure to the virus. There are benefits reported from working from home, many anecdotal reports of relief for many people from long commutes, relief from negative office politics, and flexibility. You know, I think many of us who had the privilege of being able to work from home suddenly found we had a few extra hours here and there, and we also found ourselves at home with our children, which had its stressors, but also had its moments of pleasure where you could actually see your children during the day and maybe spend some quality time. There was also a cost savings of this for employers, by some estimates around $11,000 per worker. Obviously rents and other overhead utilities were shifted to the worker, to the workplace at home, from the workplace to the worker. Also cost savings for employees. Commute times were much reduced or disappeared completely, so gas and driving maintenance was something that improved, as well as food and eating out. Obviously that had another impact on a part of the economy that we know has suffered severely in the hospitality and food industries, but it did save people a lot of money when they could work from home. A large percentage of workers still report wanting to work and continue working from home after the pandemic, or at least in what we're calling a hybrid situation. And some reports suggest that almost 40% said that they would leave their current job to do so. And I'm not sure if this is happening in Brazil, but in the United States, we are experiencing very high turnovers in many industries. People are leaving jobs that were less than ideal when they can, and finding jobs or moving into situations where they can continue having the flexibility, the low commute times that they enjoyed during the pandemic. But is remote work safe or safer? We know that most workers who work from home were far less likely to be exposed to the virus compared to those who worked outside the home. But we also know that home workers, those in the informal economies throughout the world, have always been a vulnerable workforce without labor protections very often, and oftentimes without access to health and safety enforcement and so forth. So I think it's very important to think about how do we ensure that the new remote workforce receives the resources and attention to health and safety protections, but how do we get occupational safety and health and labor regulations enforced in a home environment? And this is something I think we're going to be struggling with going forward in those workplaces and offices that have remained, that are going to remain remote permanently. Is remote work healthy? And this is another question, just because it obviously provides protection from viral infection, but we also knew that during the pandemic, almost 70% of parents that were involved in distance or online learning for their children found it was a significant source of stress and anxiety to try to work and help their children. This is changing now as children are returning to schools. So we'll see how that continues. 60% of remote workers reported that they felt guilty about taking any kind of break while working from home. And this Harvard Business School study of more than 3 million people in 16 cities worldwide reported that their average workday increased by over 48 minutes. So what we're finding is that productivity increased in many of these home workers' offices and in those that went remote, and companies were more than happy to see that productivity increased, and I think that's a contributing factor to companies considering leaving remote workers, in a home environment. So there's positives and negatives to that. Obviously, people are working more hours. It's meaning that work is slipping over into their home lives, into their private lives. Work hours are increasing. Zoom fatigue. As we went online, virtual interactions among employees for many have been very tiring and stressful. It's not a natural way of interacting for people online, because there's not the give and take of the conversation. I know for me, when I'm presenting to large groups online, it's very hard not to see an audience of smiling faces and seeing the nods and so forth. However, it has been a source of connection, and not having to travel to Brazil, but being able to present in this forum has its positive sides. One important point that we've found about remote work is that younger people really miss the social interaction of a workplace. And not only that, may feel more isolated because they don't have the family yet, or they don't have the social network in place, especially when we're social distancing. But more importantly, a workplace is an environment where there are resources and support, mentorships. There's informal training that occurs for young workers that may not happen when they're working from home. So there is a concern there that young workers may miss out on forms of training that they would get informally in a workplace setting. And of course, millions of essential frontline workers remain vulnerable even today to infectious disease, especially given the Delta variant. We know there's been more breakthrough infections. So we are aware that essential workers, those who are critical to maintaining services to society in healthcare, food, agriculture, our first responders, transportation workers, again, they have higher exposure because the work can't be done at home. They work in close proximity to others, use public transport, and some sectors also have lower incomes. So we know socioeconomic status plays a role in health and access to health care. We know that there's increased health risk for low-income workers, and often an inability to stay home if sick. And this was a major concern early in the pandemic, since some workers did not have sick pay. And so leaving work and wanting to get tested for coronavirus was a major concern for workers who didn't have sick pay in the United States especially, and couldn't afford to lose their wages. So this will continue to be a concern unless sick pay is addressed as an important aspect of work, especially for essential workers. My colleagues and I actually published an editorial in the Journal of Occupational Environmental Medicine looking at some of these issues of work and its impact on different sectors of workers. We know exposure differs, as I just mentioned, but we also argue that severity of illness is impacted by the kind of work that you have. And what we found is that those working in jobs where there are a high risk for psychosocial stressors are also more likely to have developed comorbidities, hypertension, diabetes, obesity, cardiovascular disease. These are patterned by socioeconomic status. So in the United States, for example, people of color are more likely to work in low socioeconomic status jobs, which have higher job stressors. We'll talk about that in a moment. This increases their comorbidities, as I said. But in addition, during the pandemic, we have higher work stresses because of the pandemic itself. There was increases in job insecurity. People were laid off or were concerned about being laid off or were concerned about not working and exposing themselves to the virus. There was more work-family conflict. If you are a low-wage worker, your children are home from school, what do you do to make a living? It was almost impossible for many people to continue working. Also, as the pandemic progressed, what we found was, excuse me, there were more increases in job demands and workload as staff shortages increased. And staffing shortages occurred in industries, particularly in healthcare, but more recently in education, as people left their jobs after experiencing a lot of burnout as a result of the pandemic, which is leading to people having a much higher workload. And of course, lack of sick pay or inadequate sick pay is a major stressor that is impacted by the pandemic, but also is a continuing problem in terms of healthy and decent work. So our argument is that these psychosocial work stressors increase the vulnerability and severity of COVID-19 illness because they increase these comorbidities, but also they weaken the immune system. And we've sort of discussed the mechanisms of that and how these kinds of stressful situations may have increased the vulnerability of those that were exposed to COVID-19 and had more severe illness and death. Also, excuse me, during the pandemic, we have seen a global mental health epidemic increase even more. We know that fear and anxiety increased because of the possibility of infection, and people lost loved ones. There was economic turmoil because of loss of jobs and income. Physical and social distancing policies meant isolation from friends and family. We know that social isolation is a major risk factor for mental health problems. We have seen in the United States, and I'm sure globally, an increased use and abuse of alcohol and drugs, leading to an increase in opioid overdoses in the United States, which were already high before the pandemic. We've had an uptick even during 2020 in opioid overdoses. The World Health Organization reported that mental health and substance abuse services have were disrupted globally, obviously affecting those with pre-existing mental illnesses. Services for older and younger people were affected. And of course, our healthcare workers have been barraged with, especially those working in the COVID wards, with an endless surge after surge of sick people who are very sick and dying. Burnout and turnover has increased dramatically in this workforce. And the World Health Organization states that one of the important steps to take next is that workplaces and health and safety programs need to focus on mental health and psychosocial support, what we call a whole of society approach, where any local or outside support that aims to protect or promote psychosocial well-being or prevent or treat mental health conditions is an important inclusion in health and safety. So psychosocial stressors, I argue, are the future of healthy and safe work, or at least addressing psychosocial stresses. They need to be addressed and going forward to prevent the explosion of the chronic disease burden from getting worse, to reduce the risk factors for people on the front lines, people who already are in vulnerable positions and are in jobs where these stressors are a major risk factor. So what do we mean by the work stress epidemic? In the United States, we know from national surveys that usually around 30% of US adults report feeling stressed out and tense during the workday. 3 out of 5 US adults report that work is a somewhat or very significant source of stress that is just behind money and financial concerns. In this one report, 55% of US adults felt stressed the day before in a question that asked about current stress levels, which was an increase from 2017 and one of the highest rates among 143 countries in a recent World Gallup poll. Now, of course, we don't have great data yet, national data, about how these perceived stress levels have increased during the pandemic. But I imagine at least we have some surveys that were taken during 2020 on stress levels, which were obviously particularly high compared to the year before. So what do I mean by work stresses? I'm sure many are familiar with the idea of stress, our natural fight or flight response, which if it becomes a chronic fight or flight response, meaning that we don't spend time to recover from the experience of stress, this has an effect physiologically, biologically on the body. It can lead to long-term distress and long-term chronic health problems, as well as short-term chronic health problems like trouble sleeping, headaches, fatigue, musculoskeletal issues, and then eventually, after a long enough exposure, we know that it has an impact on people's cardiovascular system, increases blood pressure, as well as on their mental health and increases depression. So work stress is not just the experience or the perception of stress, it's also located in the workplace, in the work environment. When we talk about work stress in our field, we're talking about stressors, the sources of stress. And we really believe that focusing on those is a way of preventing the stress response from occurring in a chronic way in the first place. So for many workers in low socioeconomic status jobs, we know that elements of work, these work places, for example, those working in factories, on assembly lines, monotonous work and having low job control are major risk factors for poor health. Mandatory overtime, we know has had a major impact as more and more companies and industries don't hire new positions. They require existing workers to do more overtime to fill in production gaps or 24/7 working conditions. Precarious work is also increased. I think I heard some discussion about the app companies that we've relied on more and more over the pandemic. These non-standard forms of employment, we know from research, are major contributors to poor health and job insecurity. Working from job to job, short-term contracts, being a temp worker, these are difficult because they cause job insecurity. They can create irregular schedules, low income, and so forth. Other stressors we know reach across socioeconomic status and affect more high status workers as well. Work-life imbalance, which obviously was a major issue during the pandemic, has been linked to burnout, has been linked to other forms of health problems, including higher blood pressure and mental health issues. Understaffing and workload, major concerns right now as people are leaving workplaces. It's resulting in a staffing crisis in many sectors, which increases workloads and job demands and so forth. What we also know from research before the pandemic is that these work stresses are increasing. These are national data from the NIOSH Quality of Work-Life Survey in the United States, which showing a trend, my colleagues put this together, showed job strain, which is an increase in demands and a decrease in job control, which is having some kind of say or ability to utilize your skills in healthy ways on the job. Job strain is a major contributor to heart disease and stroke, also depression. So you can see between 2002 and 2014, there was a significant trend increase in job strain. We also found an increase in work-family conflict between 2002 and 2014. Hopefully we can extend this analysis to 2018, and then the next data won't be till 2022. which will be interesting, but we have seen even before the pandemic an increasing trend in more work-family conflict, which might be related to the increase in annual hours worked in the United States. And in many countries, we've seen work hours increase. A recent report by the World Health Organization has showed that long work hours are a major contributor to stroke. It's a report that's available from the WHO. So the unhealthy consequences of these work stressors, you know, we know from research that they affect, as I've mentioned, cardiovascular disease, job strain, effort, reward imbalance, long work hours, organizational injustice, shift work are all major risk factors for cardiovascular disease. And we have a number of systematic reviews and meta-analyses that have been able to show pretty good moderate to strong evidence of the relationships between these kinds of work stressors and these chronic diseases. As well, they're impacting on high blood pressure and hypertension, and burnout and depression. Other health outcomes, there's an effect of work stresses on injuries, musculoskeletal disorders. We know suicide risk as well, suicidal ideation is impacted by work stress, and also substance abuse. In the United States, and I'm sure this is global, we are seeing increases in reports of poor mental health. This was poor mental health reported for 15 days or more in the past month. So between 2002 and 2012, we've seen increases in the self-reports of poor mental health, which are very good indicators of severe mental health problems when you're missing, you know, 15 days of a month because of mental health issues. We're also seeing increases between 2004 and 2016 in the number of hours of sleep. Many people are experiencing, more people are experiencing less than 6 hours sleep a night during this time period. And we know sleep is a major contributor, or lack of sleep, to cardiovascular diseases. Unfortunately, in the United States, as well, and maybe peculiarly to the United States, we've seen an increase in all-cause mortality, especially among working-age populations. We know, unfortunately, that many of these, this mortality is affected by diseases related to stress. So you can see that for cardiovascular disease, while most high-income developed countries have seen a steady decrease in cardiovascular disease mortality, in the United States, we've seen a leveling off and even slight increases over the last several years in cardiovascular disease deaths. At the same time, in these working age populations, we're seeing a statistically significant increase in intentional self-harm or suicide, in accidental drug poisoning or opioid overdoses, and also in alcoholic liver disease. And these are important findings that have actually had an impact on US life expectancy, which has decreased for several years in a row now. And we think it is related to these, what we call deaths of despair. And Case and Angus Deaton at Harvard have published a lot on these issues. It will be interesting to see. We know that suicide has increased over the last 12 months, whether this trend continues because of the pandemic. You can see here that the suicide rates have been increasing in working age populations. This is among men. You can see in those age groups the increase from 1999 to 2018. Worldwide, over 800,000 deaths, people have died from suicide. This was in 2012. And the suicide rates have been increasing globally. We know that this is because of common mental health issues, depression, and anxiety. So suicide, you know, this guide has been written by the World Health Organization, about ways to prevent suicide. And one of the findings that we're seeing is that work is a contributing factor through mental health concerns to the increasing suicide rates. Not only are we seeing these effects on people's health overall in populations, but we know that this is a massive cost, that work stressors we know of do impact healthcare costs. This is a model that was put together by a Harvard economist, along with the Stanford economists, Jeffrey Pfeffer and Joel Goh. Jeffrey Pfeffer wrote this this book, Dying for a Paycheck, based on their economic modeling of 10 major work stressors: demands, control, support, long work hours, shift work, work-life conflict, organizational injustice, unemployment, job insecurity, and lack of health insurance. And what they found is that over 120,000 deaths per year are related to the way U.S. companies manage workers, meaning these impacts from these work stressors are causing preventable deaths. They also calculated that these work stressors contribute to about 5 to 8% of annual healthcare costs. And as we know, the U.S. spends trillions of dollars on healthcare every year, amounts to around $180 billion in healthcare costs. We believe this is a conservative estimate. There have been important scientific consensus conferences recently that the Tokyo Declaration, which was part of a major ICO conference some years ago now, which suggested 10 to 20% of cardiovascular disease mortality may in fact be due to work-related factors. So that would obviously be a much higher cost. And in the WHO and the ILO just released a joint estimate on work-related burden of disease and injury. This was just released in 2021. They found that almost 2 million people die per year from preventable work-related illnesses and injuries. The majority of these deaths, 81%, are from non-communicable diseases, as I've been suggesting: pulmonary, stroke, and heart disease. 19% are from occupational injuries, and over 750,000 deaths, the largest work-related disease burden, is resulting from long work hours. So the psychosocial risks related to physical and psychological illnesses are also underestimated in these estimates because they did not take into account the burden of mental health, its effects on suicide, and the health-related direct and indirect costs associated with that. We know that the burden of growing mental health crisis is, as I said, not counted. And again, these work-related illnesses, as we move forward, and we think about the possibility of future infectious disease epidemics, continue to make workers unequally more vulnerable to infectious diseases. So as the director of the Department of Environmental Climate Change and Health at the WHO, Dr. Maria Neira, says, ensuring the health and safety among workers is a shared responsibility of the health and labor sector, as is leaving no workers behind in this regard. This is really about inequality and addressing the inequality of exposure to psychosocial stressors and the inequality in the health effects of psychosocial stressors. So she says, in the spirit of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, health and labor must work together hand in hand to ensure that this large disease burden is eliminated. So how do we do that? And this last part of my presentation really tries to grapple with and show you that there are levels of intervention in order to address these kinds of work-related effects. This is a classic intervention triangle, which shows the most effective way of addressing a exposure, or in this case a stressor, is to prevent the stressor. Primary prevention is obviously always the most effective. Then of course reducing the stressor, and then lastly the least effective is the individual, addressing the individual. You know, by the time someone is sick or ill or having a dramatic stress response, the amount of money and time it takes to help people to change those experiences become exorbitant. We can see that even among dealing with the medical treatment of chronic disease. If we can prevent stress from causing increased blood pressure or hypertension, imagine how much hypertension treatment we can prevent or reduce is what we think about. So nationally, we know many countries are able to and have prevention policies, guidelines, and standards and laws. We know in Europe, the EU OSHA has guidelines and a framework agreement among member states on work-related stress. Also, each of the many of the EU countries, especially in Scandinavian countries, have had work environment legislation in place since the 1970s and 80s. They pay attention to psychosocial stress as a hazard as part of occupational health and safety. More recently, the UK has developed management standards for work-related stress. This approach is a step-by-step approach for employers to begin to address work-related stress among employees with a very sophisticated step-by-step approach. In Canada, our colleagues were successful in creating a national standard for psychological health and safety in the workplace. Unfortunately, it's a voluntary standard, but it does provide guidelines for employers to begin to address mental health injury and other issues in the workplace. In Japan, they have a stress check program, a national policy requiring employers to monitor and screen for psychosocial stress. There's been a lot written about the effectiveness of this program, and we know that there are problems with implementation and enforcement. Other countries also have various levels of guidelines or legislation. We know in Colombia there is a national legislation guiding employers to address psychosocial risk. There is as well in Australia, South Korea, Mexico, and Chile. Unfortunately, in the United States, we do not have any national guidelines or standards regarding work stress prevention or healthy work yet. And I know I've come across this recent research article on psychosocial risks in the health of health workers, a reflection piece, opinion article on the Brazilian labor reforms, which I am not completely familiar with, but the authors argue here that the 2017 labor reforms have weakened labor relations, which has increased workers' exposures to risks in the workplace, and it does potentially result in ill health. Also, changes in the labor sphere, they mention, are contributing to newly emerging psychosocial risks, including increasing workloads and precarity. So the authors in this study argue, and I am an outsider, but bringing in the insider's perspective from this group here, Brazil must legally recognize psychosocial risks as occupational hazards, institute programs to manage them in all occupational environments in order to reduce the negative impacts on the health and well-being of workers. So I know in Brazil as well, we are moving ahead with really taking these issues seriously. And back in 2010, we know that the World Health Organization and the UN created a healthy workplace framework, pretty extensive way of addressing a healthy workplace and creating a healthy workplace. Let me just move this off here. And they argue that a healthy workplace is one in which workers and managers collaborate to use a continual improvement process to protect and promote the health, safety, and well-being of all workers. They identify 5 key factors as an important part of creating a healthy work environment, including leadership commitment and engagement, involving workers and their representatives, which is a fundamental part we've found in our intervention research, which I'll talk about in a minute, addressing and respecting business ethics and legality, use of a systematic and comprehensive process to ensure effectiveness and continual improvement. as well as looking at sustainability, integration of all these factors in the workplace. Oops. Recently, many of you may know that the International Standards Organization, with member countries and committees from all over the world, have released in 2021, just recently, guidelines for managing psychosocial risk within occupational health and safety managers. This is ISO 45003. It enables organizations to prevent work-related injury and ill health of workers and to promote worker well-being. Again, similarly to the World Health Organization's healthy workplace framework, really it is about developing and implementing and maintaining a continual improvement of healthy and safe workplaces involving all levels of an organization. Unfortunately, in the United States, although we have had some input into this new international standard, our OSHA already lacks enforcement mechanisms, so we are really faced with the reality that it is unlikely to be adopted in this anti-regulation environment in the United States anytime soon. So what then, I say, are the alternative strategies, maybe like Brazil, but definitely in the United States, where we're not probably going to see national regulation on psychosocial risk like many other countries. And I think coming out of that US context where we lack national awareness of many issues, we have a patchwork of state legislation and of obviously political division extraordinaire right now, that it's unlikely we'll ever see cohesive national legislation in the United States. And this may be true for many other countries. But what are the alternative strategies that are being taken to really focus on preventing work stress and promoting healthy work? And I'm going to cover these briefly. We have a government organization, the National Institutes of Occupational Safety and Health, which was created in 1970 along with the Occupational Safety and Health Act. The Total Worker Health Program is a program that was developed by NIOSH to really begin to address worker well-being, and they also fund centers of excellence that can continue research on well-being and healthy work. I'm going to mention briefly the importance of scientific intervention research partnerships that have and do show best practices for work stress interventions. And there are some very successful and important systematic reviews that are gathered from these ongoing intervention research partnerships that can show you how to reduce work stress in an organization. Also, our trade unions and labor movement have been successful in many instances of creating contract language that allows the addressing of work stress issues or sources of work stress. And at the state and local levels, there are some examples in the United States of ordinances and state regulations that have impacts on health and well-being. And then, public health campaigns, raising awareness, and I'll talk briefly about our Healthy Work campaign and why we think that raising awareness about the issue is also an important step forward. So the NIOSH Total Worker Health Program is a program that, well, Total Worker Health itself is a set of policies, programs, and practices that integrate protection from work-related safety and health hazards with promotion of injury and illness prevention efforts to advance worker well-being. So the idea here that NIOSH came up with is to link together two silos, occupational health and safety with health promotion or wellness. Wellness has become obviously a major industry in the United States, as it may be in Brazil as well. Health promotion efforts within companies to improve worker behaviors and worker health have mixed results in research. But the idea that NIOSH had was that these two together were more effective than each one separately. So NIOSH, through the Centers of Excellence, have created tools and resources to help guide employers to create or expand organizational cultures of safety, health, and well-being. As I mentioned, a lot of the research has deferred to health promotion, but especially in the last 5 years, there's a lot of direct acknowledgement of the impact of healthy work design and how work organization contributes to chronic health problems. The Centers of Excellence, there are now 10 in the United States, including a new one in California, which just started. This I'd like to highlight. It's a Total Worker Health Center from New England. Their research has led to the development of this Healthy Workplace Participatory Program. They have some fantastic guidance and resources and tools that employers can use to adopt what they call a total worker health approach. The central key point in the Healthy Work Participatory Program is to develop and engage programs with employees and designing integrated solutions that address a wide range of work environment issues. So check this out, because we also use it in our Healthy Work campaign, promote use of it for organizations and employers. Scientific research has been ongoing, looking at interventions, work organization interventions. We know that researchers have collaborated with labor and management to conduct workplace intervention research, but of course this takes much time and many dollars. Grants have been few and far between in the United States. A lot of this research has taken place in Europe and Canada, but it has developed evidence-based practices, and it also mostly includes a form of participatory action research, where the goal is improvement of the workplace and the prevention of work stressors. And a lot of the important work organization research involves employees or workers in successful interventions. We found in the research as well that the drivers of change, though, tend to be middle management, and that these players are key in successful intervention implementation in the workplace. This example is from researchers, our colleagues in Canada, in Quebec, and they worked with a hospital system in Quebec to conduct risk assessments using employee surveys to measure work stressors. They measured job strain and effort-reward imbalance, and they also measured psychological distress, mental health symptoms. They conducted interviews with key informants, and they developed an intervention team which consisted of the researchers, but also nurses, RNs, nurses aides, members from administration, HR, and also local union representation. This intervention team gave feedback to management, to employees and unions, a continual improvement process. They compared work stresses and psychological distress to the provincial averages as well, so they will be able to make a comparison there as to the baseline of work stress and psychological distress among workers in the hospital system. The team actually came up with recommendations based on 56 adverse working conditions and proposed solutions. And some of these solutions, some examples were greater consultation with nurses on staffing, a training plan and schedule, ergonomic improvements, obviously lifting patient load is an important issue, the improvement of team communication, social support is a major health protective factor, task rotation between nurses and aides, which improves skill discretion, which improves the job control ideas, job enrichments, training for nurses aides, reducing delays in filling open staff positions, which obviously impacts mandatory overtime, better guidance and training of new staff, and discussion with doctors about nurses' work that's taken for granted, which was a major concern. After 3 years of implementing this program, the researchers were able to compare the impact of these interventions at the hospital that received them and compare them to a control hospital that did not receive these interventions. They did find a reduction of several work stresses, including demands and low rewards. There was not a significant change in supervisor support at the intervention hospital, unfortunately, but there was a decline in supervisor support at the control hospital. There weren't changes in sleeping problems or psychological distress, but they did find that there were significant reductions in work-related and personal burnout. So this is a highly successful study that's been published quite significantly over the last several years. Another strategy we believe that's really important is the impact or the importance of trade unions bargaining over health and safety. We know in the United States, labor union membership has been in steep decline since the 1980s. Now we're somewhere around 10% of the workforce is part of a union. But contracts that include specific provisions to improve working conditions and make work healthier also tend to reduce work stresses and the effects of COVID-19. And I'll show you some examples of how labor unions have been able to address health and safety during COVID-19. Unfortunately, these are often not scientifically studied to determine the effectiveness of these contracts, but they are legally binding and enforceable. This was an example of a new contract that was won by airport workers and security employees in New York. The campaign was between 2017 and 2020. It was due to very low wages, a lot of last-minute scheduling changes, no overtime pay, hazardous working conditions, and a lack of safety training. And the union workers achieved work schedule changes. For example, employees were provided a 1 week in advance notice of schedule changes. The employers were required to establish a regular work week with a minimum of 20 hours of work per week. And as we know with low-wage workers, the important thing is to be able to work enough hours to make ends meet and to pay the bills, and also to manage childcare and family time. When you don't have advance notice of your schedule, that's very difficult. Vacant jobs were awarded based on seniority. Employees were not to be assigned an unreasonable workload. Employers were required to supply employees with uniforms and PPE and provide safety training. In addition, a labor management committee was created, which was responsible for labor relations, worker health and safety, and customer service. So it involved labor and management and workers in creating this continual improvement process. It's one mechanism. During COVID-19, we know of several successful examples of labor unions that were able to address health and safety issues, which were a major concern for teachers. For example, they used contract action teams to address extra work that was demanded of them by administrators on top of the already developing online learning activities and monitoring student progress and participation. So they were able to I think administrators were requiring them to call every student once a week, and they protested this as not feasible given their additional workload, and they were able to win that. University of Chicago graduate employees also won 2 weeks paid sick leave, mental health counseling. The university's healthcare provider was able to cover all COVID-related out-of-network expenses if someone was to get COVID. Also, they were able to win 80 new summer internships and assistantships for international students who, because of COVID-19, didn't have a source of income. The schools were closed. They were not able to work. So this helped those international students, maintain some kind of life while the schools were shut down, universities. So local regulation, we know in the US national level is limited. You know, we have difficulty enforcing our existing labor legislation, a lack of inspectors, you know, anti-regulatory environment. It's very difficult. There has been some new labor legislation, even before the pandemic, on violence in healthcare, workplace violence legislation, legislation on paid vacations and sick leave. And there's also initiatives at local levels. So in several cities, San Francisco, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., Milwaukee, New York City, etc., they were able to all create laws requiring paid sick leave. And then on the U.S. state level, especially in California, which is one of the early states, minimum staffing levels for nurses was a major win, as well as bans on mandatory overtime. And some states have instituted paid family leave because, as you know, the United States has one of the has no national legislation for paid family leave. And these are some examples of fair workweek laws that were passed by cities, including in San Francisco, San Jose, Seattle, Oregon, New York City. These are ordinances that require employers to create regular work weeks, advance notice of scheduling changes to retail and fast food workers. And these low-income workers, we know, you know, are oftentimes managing these jobs as full-time jobs to take care of families. So without advance notice of scheduling changes or inadequate hours, it's very hard to make ends meet. So these ordinances address that issue for in many cities. I'm going to skip past that one for now. One last section, I think I've still got a few minutes left. How am I looking on time? 5 minutes? Okay. So we have all of these mechanisms at play in the United States and globally. You know, we have these, most countries have these mechanisms in place to begin to address and prevent work stress. One of the important factors we found was really focusing on increasing awareness of the impacts of stress. And how do you do that? One of the ways is to actually create a mechanism by which people can assess the stress that they have at work, or workplaces can address the stress that they then see through these assessment surveys. Part of our public health campaigns, educational processes, is to provide these tools to begin assessing stress. If you can't see it, then you can't address it. The Canadian folks that we've partnered with created the Stress Assess Survey, which is a fully online survey. It was developed by the Occupational Health Clinics for Ontario Workers and Canadian OSHA. And they were able to create the system that allows individuals to take an online survey individually, and also for workplaces to assess the levels of work stress. And they did a marvelous job and inspired us in the United States to create something similar. And I'll talk a little bit about the Healthy Work campaign, which, you know, really is a step towards, you know, providing these tools and working with local and state and even federal level to begin raising awareness and addressing psychosocial risks. So we have several objectives. Education, obviously, is a very important part of this, looking at how work impacts our health, the social and financial costs, and also the solutions. We want to assess the workplace for unhealthy work stressors. We want to equip workers and organizations with healthy work tools. Really important, the you know, once you assess work and you have employees fill out surveys, what do you do with those results? How do you take that data and implement change? And then more broadly, we have a focus on really inspiring action from all stakeholders to really share the message about healthy work and implement organizational change. We do this through our website at healthywork.org. We have blogs and newsletters, articles on Medium, social media campaign, and we have just launched our own survey based in the United States for individuals. It was launched in January 2021. Anyone can access it. It's a free service. People can click on the link, fill out the survey, and they can get a free email report of their personal stressors that are compared to national scores from our National Quality of Work Life Survey. And the same thing can be done for organizations, which we've just launched in September, which allows organizations to receive a comprehensive report of all the workplace issues, psychosocial stressors, and those are compared to national data as well. This is an example of the report that we provide. You can see that it shows the levels of demands and workload and job control in the left-hand box. We flag them red when they are higher than the national averages and the percentage of people at high risk. We also measure workplace justice issues like bullying, sexual harassment, and experiences of discrimination. We have some measures on physical hazards, as well as work arrangements, work hours, scheduling, precarious employment. Wage theft is a major concern in many sectors of the U.S. economy. And we also have a section on the COVID-19 impacts, looking at how individuals are impacted by COVID-19. And then lastly, we have some health data that can also be compared to national averages. So it will show an organization overall what some of the health issues might be in their workforce. We do equip employers with tools. This four-step process, which involves reviewing and sharing the survey information with all parts of the organization. Really thinking about the costs of unhealthy work to organizations, which is step 2. And then we offer many ideas about how to reduce work stresses, and we offer a series of case reports from various sectors we call healthy work strategies, which summarize workplace research projects like the Quebec Hospital study, programs and policies, or laws and regulations that are available to promote healthy work. This is our Healthy Work Strategies pages. You can see those sections. We have case studies that are accessible and available to everybody as examples of how to begin to address these aspects of the workplace that impact poor health. So you can see we have examples of ways to improve work-family balance, reduce bullying, reduce job demands, improve job control, address sexual harassment and violence in the workplace. And we have a series of case studies on how different organizations have addressed work-related, COVID-19 work-related work stressors. So in conclusion, you know, the global pandemic, I think it's clear, has transformed work for many, perhaps permanently, with the work from home and remote work maybe continuing. But COVID-19 has also highlighted the worst outcomes in some groups because of existing problems and health inequalities and the vulnerability of workers, especially low-wage workers. And this is going to continue on beyond the pandemic, but the pandemic has really heightened the vulnerability of our workforce. Psychosocial work stresses are getting worse. They have been worsening because of the pandemic. And they're impacting the health of already vulnerable workers. So stress at work and psychological health, you know, I have to argue must continue and must be addressed to prevent and help to prevent the global chronic disease and mental health burden in societies. And we need multi-level approaches to reducing or preventing psychosocial hazards. National or international laws, state and local laws are also effective. Government programs, as well as workplace research partnerships. I think work stress assessment tools should be made available to employers so that you can begin to see the problem. And again, public health movements. I think we've been working hard with our colleagues in different parts of Latin America to bring the Healthy Work campaign and its messages to countries in Latin America as well, to raise awareness. And I just want to thank everybody for your time and your interest in these issues. I really am proud to be a part of this international effort, to focus on how we build safe and healthy work, decent work, and I think that's very in line with our campaign to improve job quality and health. So I thank you for your time and appreciate all your efforts.
Obrigada, doutora Marni.
Thank you, Dr. Marnie. Your considerations and explanations definitely have made us reflect on the topic as well. Whether we are manager or professionals or judges and prosecutors, labor prosecutors, lawyers, but especially the labor professional, the union professors and the employees, employers as well. It's important for us to know what happens throughout the world and the mental health world, and for us to take actions to establish long-lasting programs for mental health that are connected to the situation of sexual harassment and the fear and anxieties through which we're going and experience during this time of pandemic. From on my part, I was extremely happy and I learned a lot with what was explained by you, and you managed to raise the awareness with some issues that we have to consider in our daily lives. Thank you very much, Dr. Marnie.
Há tempo para perguntas?
Is there any time for questions? There are no questions during the conference time, but during the panels only. But I would like to thank Dr. Marnie Robson. We met in Porto Alegre and during the one conference, and then I saw how good and deep the research and the interest that she has to move forward with this research, and it definitely improved our event. And I thank you very much. And on behalf of the organization, and I do thank you. And the researchers, this will be available on YouTube, and researchers will be available to access it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I also would like to thank you for everything that you taught us, and we're gonna dig deeper and according to your studies to try and put it into our realities. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Pergunto ao cerimonial se nós
Now I'll ask the ceremonialist whether we can close the session. Yes, okay.
Doutora Lorena, abraço para.
So, Dr. Lorena, I send you a big hug and thank you very much. And it was a pleasure seeing you. And Dr. Sebastian too, it was very good to see you again. And I send everyone a big hug. Can we leave the meeting? Yes. So we thank the presence of the officers and authorities that presented here and the audience, that everyone that listened to us and watched our conference and our presentation. Tomorrow we're going to come back with the fifth panel, the work environment and